Welcome, friend. I'm glad you're here tonight. The world outside is slowing down, and so are we. The night hums softly, perfect for stories that travel far beyond the clock. Settle in. Breathe. Let your thoughts find room to wander. Wherever you're listening from, this moment is ours. A quiet doorway into history's hush. Tonight's story will take us through forgotten empires, fading stars, and the echoes left behind. If you enjoy drifting through the past like this, unhurried, curious, at peace, subscribe and keep a place by the fire for next time. There's always another story waiting in the dark. The story begins with light, too much of it. Sunlight spills over domes plated in gold, bouncing off mirrored courtyards and torchlit banquet halls until the whole capital looks like it's been set aflame by its own vanity. Merchants shout across marble plazas crowded with perfume and silk. The air hums with the jingle of coins, a steady metallic heartbeat that never sleeps. In the royal city, wealth is the language everyone understands, and those who speak it loudly enough summon obedience, awe, and fear. But behind the brilliance there's rot. The laborers who polish the walls eat little more than grain husks. Far from the markets, fields lie parched where irrigation canals have broken. The emperor's celebration, fires light up the night sky even as famine torchlines burn at the borders. The empire, drunk on its riches, mistakes the shimmer of gold for the glow of life itself. Within this mirage of perfection, a rumor spreads quietly, the way dust drifts under locked doors. Riders bring stories of a figure from the northern steppe, a warlord or prophet depending on who tells it, who despises gold so completely that he punishes those who carry it. They say he camps in open plains instead of palaces, that he drinks water collected from rain and eats whatever his soldiers eat. He is called many things: the horse prophet, the tent emperor, the conqueror who banned gold. At first the nobles laugh. How can a man rule without wealth? But laughter grows thin when news arrives that another trading city has fallen to this same austere legion. His banners move like thunderheads, and the wind of his name reaches even the enclosed gardens of the capital. One chronicler writes that when his army was first seen on the horizon, it looked less like men approaching than a storm riding upright. Dust swirled around hooves and wheels, obscuring where sky ended and earth began. At the center rode the conqueror, clad not in jeweled armor but in leather worn smooth by weather and time. His eyes, witnesses said, were not the eyes of a man hungry for plunder, but of someone measuring the fragility of the world before him. Every gesture of his was quiet, deliberate. When his generals proposed rewarding themselves with captured treasure, he refused. Gold blinds more surely than smoke, he told them. That phrase would later echo through generations, a warning and a mystery alike. To the empire's merchants he was a mad fanatic, determined to annihilate trade. To the poor he was almost messianic, proof that wealth's monopoly could be broken. And yet the man himself seemed untouched by either perception. He carried the scent of open grasslands wherever he went, a reminder that life could exist without grandeur. His command tent, a patch of coarse fabric dyed with soot, stood at the center of his encampment instead of a marble throne room. Advisors sat on the ground around him, arguments dissolving in the hiss of the wind against canvas. Decisions that would alter kingdoms were discussed to the rhythm of crackling fires and animal calls from the night. Inside the capital, the contrast haunted the palace. Chandeliers of crystal threw light across banquet tables, where nobles whispered about this enemy who slept in a tent. Some felt contempt, others uneasy curiosity. The queen reportedly asked her chamber minister, "If he owns nothing, how can we bargain with him?" There was no answer, only the echo of distant thunder. The conqueror's viewpoint spread like contagion, that comfort breeds corruption, that pride consumes the proud more thoroughly than hunger ever could. His scorn for luxury sliced through the very principle of imperial power, and yet the paradox made him magnetic. Absolute power paired with deliberate simplicity, an emperor of dust who commanded legions yet rejected possession. Historians later would argue whether he acted from spiritual conviction or from political cunning, designed to forge unity among nomads. But his followers didn't analyze. They believed. To them he was the man who reminded them that even kings bleed the same color as commoners. The currency of his army wasn't gold, but loyalty purchased with justice and fearlessness. When villages surrendered, he distributed their stored grain to the hungry rather than claiming wealth for himself. When captured, aristocrats offered gems for mercy. He cast their offers into fires and ordered the ashes scattered. The empire trembled, not only because cities fell, but because the idea behind his campaign threatened to unmake civilization's hierarchy. If gold could be made worthless, what happened to all the power built upon it? Economists, had they existed in that time, might have compared him to an earthquake in the trade routes. Every system tethered to the metal standard shuddered. But he believed that dependence on gold enslaved nations as effectively as conquerors did. A house built of coins, he once told a foreign envoy, collapses when the coins are melted. Whether myth or translation, the phrase survived, etched into chronicles like a scar. Across his growing dominion, merchants tried to defy his decrees. Secret markets formed, bartering in gold powder hidden inside spice jars. When discovered, the conqueror ordered the powder mixed with clay and used to plaster village walls. To his followers, that image became sacred, homes literally built from the corpse of greed. His soldiers spoke of him in reverent tones. At night they told tales around fires that their leader was chosen by destiny to cleanse the world of its obsession. They spoke softly, fearing the legend might hear them and silence even praise. Back in the shimmering capital, disquiet spread. Priests preached louder, invoking divine approval for wealth, while common folk looked toward the north where the dust storm gathered. The emperor dismissed the threat until messengers brought word that entire provinces had welcomed the conqueror without resistance. It wasn't conquest by sword alone, but by agreement of spirit. People were tired of serving gods of metal. And so the invader's philosophy entered their hearts as stealthily as dawn light under a door. The chapter's lens now tightens on the conqueror himself in a rare, quiet moment. Alone at dusk, he stands outside his tent watching firelight dance across weapons stacked in piles yet unused. The air smells of grass burned during battle and of rain hesitant to fall. In his silence lies both confidence and weariness. He knows the earth under his feet once belonged to kings who trusted gold to buy eternity. Now their statues lie toppled, their treasuries empty. But he senses the same hunger that destroyed them stirring at the edges of his own ranks. That ache for possession is older than any empire, older even than his war. And so this is where the mirage reveals its true shape. While the empire of gold shines itself blind, another empire is forming in the shadows, one built on belief and discipline rather than wealth. Yet no mirage endures forever. This conqueror, who thinks he has banished gold, does not realize that desire can survive even purification. The embers of greed burn quietly inside every human heart, waiting for breath. Night descends again over the empire, but the darkness is not restful. In the far reaches of the conquered lands, temples built from tribute shimmer faintly in torchlight, and from the hills the conqueror can see those small flames like eyes staring back at him. He wonders whether all human striving is just a long chase after reflection, the shimmer that looks like light but isn't. He has taken hundreds of cities and scattered their treasuries into rivers, yet he feels no triumph. Only a growing suspicion that gold was never the enemy, that it merely wore human greed like a mask. He tries to banish the thought. Faith must remain unbroken, or the world he is building will collapse before it begins. In his camp, the wind rattles through thousands of tents like the voice of a restless god. Soldiers clean their weapons while storytellers whisper around the fires, retelling the miracle of their leader, who defied wealth itself. They believe his mission is divine, that he is chosen to purify the world. Some pray aloud that one day the whole earth will live in tents, equal beneath the same sky. Yet a different murmur moves quietly through the ranks. Are we fighting to save mankind or to build another kind of empire? The question travels like smoke, elusive but impossible to ignore. In the capital, silence has replaced laughter. The grand markets that once flashed with gems now trade cloth and bread. Statues plated with gold peel under the sun, revealing plain stone beneath. The emperor, desperate to halt collapse, calls upon scholars and priests to explain how a single man living in a tent could unravel centuries of prosperity. None can answer. Some whisper that their own greed made them vulnerable, long before the conqueror ever arrived. The city begins to resemble one of his teachings. When the body grows too fat, the soul struggles to breathe. Coffers overflow not with coin, but with regret. Diplomats sent north return empty-handed or not at all. Every missive tells the same story. His camp moves, his rule expands, his principle remains unchanged. As the chapter nears its close, see him again at dawn, standing before his horse. The sky is pale. Thin smoke still rises from the ruins of the latest captured city. He has ordered the treasuries opened, and the gold melted down into crude lumps, not to keep but to sink deep into the earth. As the molten glow drains into the soil, he speaks softly to no one in particular. Let the ground swallow what blinded men. The moment feels sacred, yet ominous. The world holds its breath, not sure whether to applaud or recoil. He rides away while behind him the fields smolder. What began as rebellion is already shaping into legend. In the decades to come, his name will divide historians. Was he a savior from greed or an architect of chaos? Even now, centuries later, that question trembles unanswered. The empire of gold has fallen, but so too has the certainty of every civilization that worships wealth. The mirage flickers, vanishes, and the wind carries only dust. Gold vanished, but desire did not. From that paradox rises our story, of a man who won the world yet camped forever in its shadow. Long before cities and crowns, before any edict against gold, there was only the steppe, an ocean of grass under an endless sky. Wind moved across it like invisible water, bending each stalk until the whole world seemed to breathe. In summer the horizon shimmered with heat, and in winter it hardened into ice and silence. For those born here, survival was not routine. It was ceremony. Each sunrise was a small victory, each night a reminder that warmth and food could never be taken for granted. In this expanse of unforgiving beauty, the conqueror took his first breath. The wind was his lullaby, the hoofbeat his heartbeat, the sky his only roof. He was born in a felt tent pitched beside a half-frozen river. His mother, they say, tied a strip of hide around his wrist instead of a gold bracelet, whispering a prayer that he would always remember the difference between strength and vanity. His tribe was small, half forgotten by stronger clans, but rich in stories older than conquest. Around their fires, the elders told how the steppe itself was once a living spirit, generous to those who respected it, merciless to the arrogant. The children listened with the same solemn attention they gave to the wind. From those tales he learned his first lesson, that the world owed no man safety, and that humility was not weakness but armor. His father was a herdsman and a seasoned rider who measured life not by years but by migrations. To him wealth meant sturdy horses, a healthy family and honor unbroken. When traders from distant towns offered coins for meat and hides, he refused the metal, insisting on salt, grain, or service in exchange. The boy watched this refusal and did not understand it then, but the image would root deep in him like a seed, dormant beneath frost. Where other children dreamed of amber ornaments or carved swords, he dreamed of speed, endurance, the whisper of wind against the ear when galloping full tilt across the plains. Perhaps the steppe carved out of him the craving for motion that would later send armies drifting like storms. Seasons taught him patience and fear in equal measure. The tribe moved with the herds, breaking camp at dawn, smoke from their fires trailing behind until the plain erased every sign of them. Winter was the true ruler. Cold reduced pride to breath and bone. Horses died, tents cracked under snow. Hunger visited every family without preference. He learned early that no rank shielded against nature's impartial hand. The men who bragged most loudly while skies were clear often wept first when storms came. From those long winters he took his notion of equality. The steppe, vast and uncaring, leveled everyone it touched. Privilege was a lie of shelter. One year a blight swept through their animals, leaving most of the herd dead before spring. His father rode to the nearest noble encampment to beg for grazing land, only to return bruised and silent. The chieftain there, famed for his gold-trimmed saddle, had turned them away, boasting that generosity froze faster than water in such times. The boy stood among the carcasses, numb with hunger and shame, staring at the distant tents glittering in the sun. In that moment, hatred arrived quietly, not as a shout, but as a cold judgment. The rich believed their wealth could tame the wind. It couldn't. That revelation, simple and cruel, marked him forever. When he was 8, a wandering monk, relic trader, healer, or fraud, depending on the teller, stopped by their camp during a snowstorm. Wrapped in threadbare cloth, the old man carried no possessions apart from a bowl carved from bone. He sat with the family for 3 days, melting snow for tea, speaking of life as circles, not lines. "The tree that grows tallest," he said, "is already falling toward the ground." The boy drank in the words. That monk would later be remembered as his first mentor, the one who taught him to measure power by purpose rather than size. Before leaving, the old man pressed his bowl into the child's hands and said, "Remember, what holds emptiness also holds everything." Years later, when the bowl appeared among the relics found after battles, historians argued whether the story was real. But to his own people, the symbolism was clear. The conqueror carried emptiness, not to fill it, but to understand it. In the boy's memory, the monk's laughter merged with the sound of the river breaking its ice each spring, a reminder that even the hardest barriers surrender to. Patience. Adolescence on the steppe was less about years than about tests endured. He hunted wild goats with nothing but a short bow, mended horse tack with his frozen fingers, until the leather bled into his palms, and learned to read the sky with the precision of scripture. Storm lines on the horizon, birds changing direction, the exact scent before rain, these were his textbooks. Each sign written by nature taught that power and fragility were never separate. The older he grew, the stronger his conviction that the earth belonged to those who respected its indifference. At 14, he witnessed his first act of tribal injustice. A neighboring chieftain organized a feast after raiding a rival herd. While common families went hungry, nobles roasted 6 carcasses in one night. He crept near the flickering bonfires, watching the golden armor of warriors reflect red in the smoke. When a young servant dropped a platter, the chieftain's lash cut the boy's face open. The future conqueror froze, sickened by the noise of laughter around the wounded child. He turned away, feeling the burn of helpless rage. He would later recount that memory to his comrades, calling it the moment he learned that plenty makes men crueler, not kinder. His moral education didn't come from priests, but from hardship. Every misfortune became a parable. When lightning struck their herd one summer, he buried the charred remains himself. His mother asked what he prayed for as he stood over them. "That I never forget they were stronger than us," he said. The answer unsettled her, simple and grim. Even then, he believed strength, unchecked by respect, destroys itself. By the time he could command a bow on horseback, the boy had acquired not only skill, but a gaze that made elders pause. It carried the weight of seeing too much too young. Other youths chased each other across meadows. He studied the patterns of migration, counting how often the grass failed to regrow where too many hooves had trampled it. He seemed already aware that every excess leaves a scar on the world. As the steppe shifted from summer green to amber, he spent long evenings beside the campfire, listening to traveling storytellers trade epics of ancient emperors who built golden capitals only to fall to dust. Each tale ended the same way. Stone crumbled, wealth scattered, names turned to echoes. He stored those endings like warnings. One night he asked an old bard why no story ends with peace. The man smiled through missing teeth. "Because peace leaves no song to sing," he said. The youth looked into the flames and answered quietly, "Then I will try to write one anyway." None took him seriously, but that vow stitched itself into his fate. Years passed, and the boy became a figure of quiet gravity within his clan. The elders said the wind itself seemed to slow when he spoke. He had grown tall, spare, weathered the way the land was, and his words carried the cadence of distance. He rarely laughed, but when he did, it felt like sunlight catching a blade after a long frost. One winter, his tribe joined others for seasonal gathering at the great plain of Orok. Dozens of camps spread across the snow, smoke rising in columns toward a dim sun. For a brief time, unity replaced hunger and rivalry. There among the mingled fires, He met men from richer clans wearing furs edged with gold thread, wealth flaunted even at the edge of starvation. He watched how those noble herdsmen treated poorer kin, forcing them to stand during councils, taking the best waterholes, tossing meat scraps to children as though to dogs. The sight deepened the line of memory already carved into him, that wound first cut during his father's rejection by a greedy chief. He began to imagine a world without ranks born of ownership, only of merit and endurance. Not all his observations were bitter. Among the gathered tribes was a storyteller woman named Siren, keeper of songs no script had ever traced. Her tales were carried from ancestor to ancestor, nothing written, only remembered. She told of spirits who chose human hosts to remind the living how fragile dominion truly was. People said when she spoke, even the horses stood still to listen. The boy listened too, his attention fierce and silent. During one tale, she said, every wind on the steppe was once a voice that refused to die. The phrase struck him deeper than she ever knew. After her performance, he asked how one learns to hear those voices. She laughed softly and said, by stillness. But few can bear stillness long enough. That winter, surrounded by laughter and barter, he spent long nights sitting outside camp, listening to the nothingness that was never truly nothing, the hiss of snow, the shifting of stars, the distant call of wolves. In that austere music, he began to sense patterns, invisible connections between things. Later, his followers would claim he could read omens in weather. Perhaps he simply listened more patiently than any other man. When his father died during a brutal frost, the young man took no time for morning feast, but set out alone with his horse, traveling farther than his tribe had ever moved. He sought the monastery rumored to rest beyond the western gorge, the one said to keep sacred fire that never extinguished. Legends claim he found it, a temple little more than a cluster of caves guarded by monks clad in worn wool. They accepted him as servant and apprentice, teaching scripture carved not in gold but in stone slabs darkened by age. Here he learned languages of trade, strategies of peace and warfare, and disciplines of meditation that anchored his restless spirit. The eldest monk told him something that would later become the seed of his philosophy. When man bows to gold, he kneels to his own fear. Conquer fear, and the world kneels willingly. Those words never left him. He left the monastery after 2 years carrying neither weapon nor wealth. Only scars on his hands from chiseling stone, and a certainty that power without restraint is no power at all. Returning to the steppe, he found his people scattered by warring clans. Tribes had turned against one another for dwindling pasture and access to trade caravans. Seeing famine and greed tearing through them as surely as winter winds, he stepped forward to mediate. He spoke not as son of one lineage, but as voice of the land itself. His argument was simple. No man truly owns what the wind can carry away. He proposed shared migration routes and punishments for hoarding food during famine. Most laughed, knowing only the law of the stronger. Yet over months small groups began to follow him, drawn not by promise of riches, but by his uncanny calm amid chaos. Wherever he went, feuds cooled, raided goods were returned, and even rival horses drank side by side without tether. It was said his presence felt like rain after drought, inevitable, cleansing, slightly terrifying. But peace on the steppe was temporary. Border raids from southern kingdoms brought caravans of metal, jewelry, and the intoxicating taste of acquisition. Leaders who had once bowed to him now flaunted silver armlets, their eyes bright with hunger. He watched his own kin unravel beneath the glitter of novelty. When his cousin was killed defending their herd, the future conqueror took the fallen weapon and declared before all, "Gold has no scent until it is burned. Then it smells of blood." That oath spread quickly. Young warriors pledged themselves to him, swearing to live by a new code forbidding vanity, theft, and betrayal. Their numbers grew not through coercion but conviction. For the first time, a unified identity began to shape itself around a moral spine instead of tribal names. Into this volatility stepped the memory of the monk's teaching, fused now with the ruthless landscape, humility as strength, control as freedom. One evening, while lightning cracked across the horizon, he gathered the elders and proposed forming an alliance to protect the steppe from southern intrusion. He spoke without embellishment, his voice blending with thunder. If we cannot master our desire, he said, others will master us with theirs. It was the first time many had seen practical philosophy forged into command. Some accepted, awed by his certainty. Others dismissed him as dreamer. But dreamers on the steppe often become storms. With every passing season his legend thickened. Tales of miraculous endurance added myth to memory. How he once guided his people through 9 days of blizzard without losing a single rider. How he crossed a river on ice, trusting only the wind's whisper for direction. Whether fact or not, belief built destiny. The young leader who once mended cracked leather straps now mended a broken culture. Beneath the same unending sky, he nurtured an ideal that hardship should make equals, not masters and servants. By his 20th spring, he had hardened into command. The long years of hunger, humility, and brutal weather had tempered every reaction. When he smiled, it was genuine. When he grew angry, the ground itself seemed to listen. His first circle of companions, hunters, herdsmen, escaped servants, would later become the architects of his early conquests. They understood his creed because they had lived it. To need nothing was the truest form of strength. Around the fire one night, he reminded them of the winter when nobles had feasted while children starved. They believed food was theirs by right, he said. But the land gives nothing by right, only by respect. As sparks rose into the darkness, his followers nodded. They were not planning empire then, only survival under a banner of fairness. The final image of this chapter returns to the landscape itself. The young man rides alone across twilight plains, the air trembling with the smell of coming rain. The horizon stretches infinitely. Sky and earth melt together in muted gold. From a distance he appears as just another nomad. But the wind carries something different in his wake, a resolve sharp enough to change nations. Behind him trail hoofprints soon erased by dust, the perfect metaphor for his belief. Nothing owned endures. Above hawks circle lazily, and as the first drops begin to fall, he raises his face to the sky and closes his eyes. In that quiet exchange between man and weather, destiny takes form. The steppe has forged him. Its cruelty gave him justice, its poverty gave him clarity, and its size taught him humility. The conqueror who would one day forbid the world's richest metal was shaped not by greed or privilege, but by wind, hunger, and silence. From those elements, an empire without walls was already stirring. Wind again was his herald. The steppe had long carried only the cries of herds and hunters, but now it carried a new sound. Thunder that did not fade, hoofbeats multiplied by thousands. The young leader rode at its center, his banner cut from plain cloth marked only by a black symbol representing the horizon line, earth meeting sky. It was simplicity itself, yet soon to become legend. That symbol meant promise, discipline, equality before the wind. In a world that worshipped gold, he offered something rarer, belief without coin. Word went out across the plains that any man of honor could join him, provided he was willing to live by the code that shaped them all. There would be no pay, only sustenance and a share of justice. Strangely, it worked. Camps swelled as riders arrived from distant clans, carrying neither titles nor treasures, just burned pride and restless loyalty. He organized them in ways unheard of among nomads. No soldier was above another. Their strength came from formation rather than rank. He divided the riders into groups bound by shared responsibility. If one failed, all bore the weight. Their loyalty was sealed not by coin, but by ritual. Each man pressed palm to chest and swore to keep his word, even if it cost his life. The oath spread like fire. It gave every warrior the dignity of purpose, usually reserved for kings. They rode together under the endless sky, stripped of ornament, armored instead in belief. Survival became ceremony and simplicity their banner. When outsiders first saw this gathering, they scoffed. How could an army without pay or plunder stand against mercenary battalions gilded in silver? Yet the plains riders were children of scarcity. They carried everything they needed in one saddlebag, could live days on wind and milk. And though they owned little, they possessed a kind of fearlessness reserved for those with nothing left to lose. Training was relentless. From dawn to dusk, they practiced coordinated rides, whirling and wheeling across dust like schools of fish, under commands shouted into the wind. Arrows loosed from horseback found their marks in flight, and when the sun fell they still drilled by moonlight, perfecting silence, speed, and obedience. His generals, former herdsmen elevated purely for merit, watched as this disciplined thunder began to take shape. He told them that gold had broken every empire because it gave men something to fight for other than conviction. Our wealth, he said, is our unity. Whoever buys loyalty never truly owns it. Those words became their law. Gradually, the tribes ceased to be a mosaic of quarrelsome kinships. They transformed into one living organism. The men began to revere their leader with the awe once reserved for spirits of the steppe. He had become translator of the wind, interpreter of fate. Some claimed even the horses felt it, galloping longer without tiring as the banner snapped overhead. Rival powers watched with growing unease. To the south, the merchant kingdoms laughed at first, labeling this movement a dust storm soon to disperse. But trade routes faltered, as nomadic patrols guarded them without tribute demands, asking only fair exchange of essential goods. To lords accustomed to bribery, this was unsettling. If these riders could function without payment, what else might they reject? Their doubts turned to fear when caravans began pledging allegiance to the banner, drawn by security and equality. A wind-blown ideology was starting to displace minted authority. Then came the first conquest. It began not as grand campaign, but as response to plea. A cluster of villages near the oasis city of Narak had been overtaxed nearly to ruin. The merchants who ruled Narak wrapped their greed in velvet, counting their coins, while peasants starved outside its gates. Messengers knelt before the conqueror, asking for protection. He listened in silence, then ordered his generals to mount by dawn. The army rode without hesitation, dust rising behind them like smoke from an unseen fire. Within 2 days, they reached the fertile valley where Narak's ivory walls shimmered under sunlight. Scouts brought reports, high fortifications, an army twice their size paid with gold. But where others saw disparity, he saw strategy. He divided his riders into smaller units spread across flanking hills, using the terrain like a weapon. The defenders advanced heavily armored, expecting an open clash. His cavalry vanished, drawing them further into plain and out of formation. Hidden units circled, cutting off their retreat, while archers rained shafts from dust clouds. It was warfare like nature itself, fluid, relentless, devoid of decorum. Narak's army collapsed by dusk. The city gates opened not from weakness, but from revolt within. The poor citizens refused to defend those who had bled them dry. As he entered Narak, witnesses say he carried no triumph in his eyes. Markets smoldered, granaries overflowed, mansions glittered even under smoke. The conqueror stood amid the ash and summoned both rich and poor to the square. The wealthy trembled, presenting jewels, hoping to buy mercy. He refused. "Gold made you deaf to hunger," he said. "Now listen to silence." He ordered their treasures melted down, the value distributed as grain to the starving. No executions, no theatrics, just quiet reordering of justice. The hungry ate, and their relief echoed across the city louder than any drumbeat. His soldiers watched in bewildered pride. They had expected reward. Instead, they witnessed morality turned into action. He preached that victory should purify, not intoxicate. Discipline was holiness. Indulgence was decay. To prevent arrogance, he decreed that every officer must eat the same rations as common troops and sleep on ground, not in halls. Loot was forbidden except for necessities, and theft within ranks punished by exile regardless of status. When asked why he denied them celebration, he answered, "The battle won against oneself is the only feast worth holding." His men carried that phrase as prayer. News of Narak's fall traveled faster than caravans. Along trade roads, merchants whispered of a lord who dismantled wealth instead of seizing it. The southern kings sent spies, each returning with stories less believable than the last. Soldiers, refusing pay, nobles living as equals among shepherds, a ruler who walked barefoot through conquered streets. Economists, had they any framework for such madness, would have called it anti-gravity. power sustained not by possessions, but by renunciation. Yet it worked. Disorder turned into order simply through example. Where other conquerors burned cities, he burned greed and left the people standing in the smoke, bewildered and free. The conquest of Narak made legend of him. Songs carried across deserts described his riders as arrows of divine justice. Children in distant lands played games chanting his name, mimicking gallops. In the courts of rival empires, the laughter had stopped. Scholars argued over whether he was blessed or cursed. Generals tried to copy his philosophy of movement, but failed because their armies demanded pay before faith. None could replicate what only conviction could sustain. As summer expanded across the plains, his banner rose in more settlements, not merely a flag of war but emblem of reform. Wherever it appeared, corruption trembled. Local chiefs reopened storehouses, debts were forgiven, and caravans resumed under protection of a new moral economy. For a brief shining moment, the land seemed to remember balance. Yet beneath that, quiet order flickered the same ember that had always burned in human hearts. Even devotion can mutate into obsession, and faith, once victorious, forgets how to doubt. The conqueror, unaware, began walking the fine line between prophet and ruler, justice and domination. Autumn came, and with it, the first test of endurance beyond victory's glow. Narak's ashes cooled, but power's heat began to rise. His followers multiplied faster than his captains could train them. New recruits arrived daily, farmers carrying pitchforks, scholars who had lost faith in kings, nomads driven from drought-struck lands. They called him Father of the Horizon, the one who drew no boundary between earth and sky, poor and rich. The name both honored and warned him. A horizon has no end, and those who chase it may never rest. He understood that every movement risks becoming the same tyranny it opposed. To protect his newborn force from corruption, he issued what he named the 10 Riders' Law, a code carved into memory rather than stone. Each law anchored discipline over indulgence. A warrior must share water before wine, must speak truth even to command, must guard the weak as fiercely as himself. Breaking these principles would mean expulsion into exile. Redemption came only through service. The code was harsh, but its fairness became their faith. In those months, he hardly slept, consumed by the work of turning ideals into infrastructure. He reorganized captured cities as self-governing communes, overseen by local councils rather than military governors. His generals protested. Such generosity seemed naive. He silenced them with calm certainty. If they govern themselves justly, they will defend themselves naturally. That logic was radical, effective, and deeply unsettling to neighbors who based rule on hierarchy. Trade lines stabilized, banditry collapsed, and caravans once again crossed the plains safely under his protection. To a world long used to chaos, this discipline looked like miracle. To ambitious kings it looked like infection. Plans were soon drawn in distant courts. Rulers convened councils, deciding that this new ideology must be stopped before it dissolved every throne. They sent envoys offering alliance in exchange for tribute, believing greed might tempt him as it had tempted every conqueror before. He received them in an open tent, its entrance flapping in wind strong enough to tear a palace banner. When the envoys presented boxes of jewels, he smiled faintly and ordered the boxes opened. Inside, gold coins glowed like imprisoned suns. He took one coin, pressed it into the dust beneath his boot, and said, "When the earth swallows gold, peace is born." Then he nodded politely for them to take their wealth back unharmed. Word of that gesture traveled faster than any army. Not everyone within his ranks applauded such defiance. Ambition crouched among his officers like wolves hiding in grass. Some whispered that generosity brought no advantage, that mercy weakened fear. He answered whispers with demonstrations. He appointed captains not for loyalty to him, but for integrity witnessed by others. One corrupt officer who accepted bribes from defeated traders was publicly stripped of his rank, but instead of death, he was ordered to live among the humbled. Merchants he had abused, working at their side until he earned forgiveness. The punishment humiliated more deeply than execution and taught sharper lessons than speeches. Meanwhile, rival empires tightened their defenses. One southern kingdom, infamous for gilded temples, decided to lure him into open conflict. They sent armies fortified by fortress walls, certain his riders would shatter against stone. Instead, he bypassed the strongholds entirely, cutting off their supply lines through constant maneuvers. His swift columns moved like shadow across plains, appearing from nowhere, vanishing before counterattacks could form. At night, villagers found arrows stuck in the gates bearing messages written in soot. Lay down greed, rise free. Terror and awe merged in equal measure. When famine struck that kingdom a year later, its soldiers deserted without battle. By restraint, he conquered what others lost through siege. These triumphs gave rise to a strange kind of devotion among the common people. Mothers named infants after him. Marketplaces echoed with prayers for his protection. He did not encourage worship, but he didn't suppress it either. Perhaps even he felt the temptation of being larger than man. Each victory fed the legend, and legends rarely obey their creators. The banner that once symbolized equality now fluttered above cities as emblem of authority. He noticed it one morning and stared long, remembering the plain line marked upon it, the horizon he'd sworn never to cross. For the first time he wondered whether faith in him had replaced faith in justice. He shook off the thought, but doubt once invited never truly leaves. Among his companions only one dared address it, a grey-haired strategist named Tolgan, who had served him since youth. During a rare moment of rest, Tolgan said, "You have taught men to live without gold, but they will soon mint your name in its place." The conqueror smiled sadly. "Then I will have to break my own image one day." He did not know how prophetic that jest would become. News of his movement reached the coasts, where merchants watched profits wane. There, pamphlets written in fear branded him destroyer of progress. They warned that he aimed to erase wealth itself, that his justice was only mask for conquest. Perception twisted like sunlight through water, hero from one angle, heretic from another. And still his armies grew, not through conscription but attraction, each man drawn to the promise that virtue could be armor. As winter returned, his council advised consolidating power, building fortifications. He refused. "Stone breeds stagnation," he said. "So long as our homes can be folded and carried, rot cannot catch us." And so they moved again, empire that left no monuments except stories. He paused in Narak once more, and found that the poor he had once fed now governed themselves with modest prosperity. Seeing this, he experienced something rarer than triumph, brief contentment. "Maybe this is how the steppe wished to see itself," he murmured. Yet even in contentment, destiny whispered for movement, the old restlessness pressing him onward toward lands still ruled by greed. The chapter closes under the same sky where it began. His banner flutters at the top of a new hill, only its plain horizon symbol cut dark against dawn. Below, thousands of tents ripple like waves, an army waiting to dissolve back into wind. He speaks to them not of conquest, but of vigilance, that greed can return in any shape, that equality survives only through labor, that discipline must guard even victory itself. The men listen, some exhausted, some inspired, all aware they stand at the beginning of something history has never seen. As the first light spills across the valley, the conqueror mounts his horse. Dust rises, gold-colored in the sun, and for a fleeting instant, he and his followers ride inside the very light they have sworn to resist. In that hour, the world changes measure. Power is no longer counted in wealth or walls, but in the number of hearts moved by conviction. And though rival kings still curse his name from behind jeweled gates, somewhere deep inside, they understand that something irreversible has entered the human story, a reminder that an empire can march on faith alone. The horizon line on the banner sways once more in the wind, a symbol both of limit and of freedom. Beneath it the conqueror rides, unaware he is becoming what he most feared, a man whose simplicity will one day bear the weight of myth. After victory came the question that has undone every victor before him: where to sit. Conquerors customarily reward themselves with stone. Citadels, marble halls, jeweled roofs that announce the permanence of their triumph. But when his generals began sketching plans for palaces, he laughed, thinking they were reciting a joke he didn't fully understand. A palace, he told them, was a cage too heavy to carry. The world itself would be his house. The steppe winds his curtains. His throne would remain a fold of cloth stretched under open sky. And before they could argue, he ordered the same tent he had slept in as a soldier, raised at the heart of his new capital, a city of white canvas pitched where Narak's ruins still smoked. The sight stunned allies and enemies alike, an emperor ruling from fabric that could be dismantled within an hour. Inside that tent, the air smelled of earth and wood smoke, not of perfume or incense. A low fire crackled at the center. Its light flickering along spears leaned in rows against the walls. Here he received emissaries, warriors and peasants alike. No one bowed. They sat cross-legged around the flame, faces equally shadowed. In the warmth and hiss of the fire, his voice traveled softly but with the weight of command. There were no thrones carved from ivory, no gilded pillars. Only a circle of humanity, held together by shared purpose. It was more than simplicity. It was sermon. His tent declared that rule was stewardship, not ownership, and that permanence exists only in the choices one makes, not in the stones one piles. The symbolism spread faster than his decrees. To some it was divine humility made visible. To others, frightening heresy against civilization itself. Foreign ambassadors returned to their courts with bewildered reports. He owns nothing, they wrote, yet all men obey him. He sleeps on dirt, yet his word turns kings to dust. In markets, artisans carved tiny replicas of the tent as charms for fairness. Meanwhile, ministers muttered among themselves that the empire looked poor without palaces, that the people might mistake austerity for weakness. But public devotion deepened. Subject tribes emulated his manner, replacing gold ornaments with carved bone, exchanging indulgence for pride in restraint. The empire glittered suddenly with the different kind of light, moral clarity rather than metal shimmer. Still, within his council, the disquiet brewed. For soldiers who had marched through fire and blood, the notion of a tented throne felt like denial of reward. They justified ambition as necessity. Hadn't they earned some comfort? One evening, as wind rattled the canvas, his most seasoned general spoke openly. "My lord," he said, "we live as wanderers while you rule a world that could house us 1,000 times. Would it dishonor virtue to enjoy what victory has given?" The conqueror answered by stirring the fire until sparks rose between them. "We did not conquer the world," he said, "to repeat its mistakes." The general bowed, unsatisfied, but the answer spread among the soldiers as challenge, proof that faith still chained passion tighter than gold ever could. Outside, storm clouds gathered. The tent trembled but did not fall. To onlookers it seemed omen and metaphor at once, the world's largest empire shivering under a fabric roof. His critics called it arrogance disguised as humility, performative poverty. They warned that the people needed monuments to believe in power. Yet his belief was inverse. Crumble walls lift morale. He trusted that the law he was building inside the human spirit would stand longer than any building of stone. He began to develop rituals around the tent, as though converting simplicity into doctrine. Each dawn he walked barefoot across dew-wet grass to greet the horizon before entering the council. He would pause there, hand raised to the rising sun, murmuring prayers taught by the steppe monks who'd shaped him. The words asked not for victory but for balance, that success not devour virtue. Observers noted that he spent longer praying on peaceful days than before battle, as if triumph frightened him more than death. His followers interpreted the act in their own ways. Some saw penance for bloodshed, others saw a dialogue between man and the wind. Whatever the truth, the ritual made the tent a sanctum where policy intertwined with meditation. Inside, governance was unlike anything known. When disputes arose between provinces, he invited both sides to speak before the fire, no matter rank or origin. Decisions came through reasoned voices, not decrees scratched on tablets. Once, a farmer accused a high official of hoarding grain. The council gasped as the emperor motioned both to sit side by side. Hours later, after testimonies and silence, the verdict came not from intimidation but consensus. The official was stripped of position and told to distribute food in person among those he'd wronged. Such transparent justice became spectacle. People traveled for days just to witness sessions inside the tent, where rulers ate with peasants from the same bowl. Foreign observers began calling it the Round Throne, eternal in motion, equal by shape. This system, though revered, rattled aristocrats more than war ever had. They craved boundaries, walls separating rulers from governed, symbols proving distance between common hands and divine right. The absence of those boundaries left them lost. In private, they mocked his habits, sleeping on thin carpets, drinking from wooden cups, patching his own cloak when it tore. Yet they could not deny his effect. Those habits had become his authority. The tent was transforming from abode into ideology, ruler and subject at once, a structure whose fragility reminded everyone that dominion was temporary. Among his soldiers, devotion took on religious tone. Before departure to new campaigns, each unit circled the tent once for blessing, touching the ropes as if drawing power from humility itself. They believed that the fabric carried protection stronger than any fortress wall, and perhaps on some mystical level it did. Battles fought after such rituals often ended swiftly, favoring them almost supernaturally. Enemies surrendered at the rumor of that moving shrine appearing on horizon. To them, the tent was not symbol of simplicity, but of invisible dominance, an empire guided by something beyond politics, maybe destiny itself. Yet not all were convinced. Within his inner circle, a deeper conflict brewed. Younger commanders, inspired by his spiritual purity, argued for dismantling even practical luxuries, ban feasts, outlaw private possessions entirely. Pragmatic generals, weary of extremity, warned that such zeal would starve morale. Men may obey holiness, one said, but they cannot live on it. The emperor listened without interruption. He knew both sides spoke truth. Idealism kept their purpose clean. Practicality kept them alive. Reconciliation between the two would define the balance of his reign. Even he was not immune to fatigue. Nights grew longer. His body accustomed to motion, now constrained by petitions and debates. Sometimes he missed the wild freedom of cavalry rides across moonlit plains. In those hours he would step outside the tent alone, gazing at the constellations that his ancestors used to navigate by. The air smelled of ash and dew, identical to the nights of his youth. He confided to no one that the stars comforted him more than courtiers ever could. They needed nothing from him. They reminded him that leadership was not permanence but orbit, a path of endless return to humility. Inside, the fire never went out. Servants kept it fed from bundles of steppe wood carried across continents. It burned so constantly that travelers claimed they could find his camp at night by following the faint glow across horizon. The fire became spiritual pulse of the empire, proof that the conqueror's heart still beat between worlds of silence and rule. When storms approached, guards shielded it with their bodies, terrified of letting that symbolic flame die. And in that simple choreography of devotion lay the miracle of his leadership. Fear and faith intertwined, sustaining each other through awe rather than command. He often told visitors who admired the tent's austerity, "I dwell in cloth so the world remembers how thin the wall is between power and sky." Those words circulated everywhere, carved into wood, sung as verse. Humility became state policy. Taxes were lowered for craftsmen. Merchants were ordered to set fair prices, regardless of wealth of buyers. The court treasury overflowed from conquered lands, but hardly a fraction was used. Instead, excess bullion was melted down into plain ingots and stored underground for famine relief. Greed shrank, and with it envy. For years the empire experienced strange prosperity, born not from opulence but moderation. A golden age precisely because it despised gold. But moderation rarely satisfies for long. Seeds of dissent still hid beneath the calm. Some generals feared that by discarding luxury, he also discarded respect. Foreign ambassadors mocked them as beggars. Trading partners fretted that lack of opulence meant poverty. An empire that did not flaunt its might risked being mistaken for weakness. The dilemma deepened: how to keep virtue visible without turning it into vanity. Tension built quietly like wind beneath the canvas. The conqueror's ideals had won hearts across continents, but ideals alone did not feed armies or rebuild cities. His council now resembled a constellation of opposites: fire and ice, zeal and reason. On one side stood the visionaries, disciples who spoke in moral absolutes. They wanted to abolish all luxury, dissolve the treasury and reduce the empire to a vast monastery of tents. On the other side waited the veterans, commanders hardened by war, who saw governance as a matter of logistics, not prayer. To them, buildings, coin and clear hierarchies were shields against chaos. The debates grew intense, muffled only by the hiss of the eternal fire between them. The emperor listened to both camps, his expression unreadable, tracing patterns in the sand with his finger while they argued. Finally, when silence returned, he refused to choose either side. "A tent without stakes flies away," he said, "but stakes without cloth only pierce the earth. We must be both." His answer satisfied no one completely, but it stilled the argument for the moment and became yet another proverb carried on the wind. Beyond politics, the tent itself began to shift meaning once again. Pilgrims made journeys hundreds of miles long just to glimpse it, describing it as half monastery, half heart. Inside its walls were rumors of miracles, sick children recovering after touching its ropes, disputes resolved before stepping onto its carpets. Priests from conquered lands interpreted it through their own creeds, some calling it a tabernacle of justice, others dismissing it as idolatry wrapped in humility. Yet even the doubters could not deny its power. It embodied not only the emperor's beliefs, but humankind's oldest yearning: to live close enough to heaven to hear it breathe. When foreign dignitaries arrived, expecting golden ceremony, they found instead an open field and that single, quiet structure flapping in wind. Meetings took place around the same low fire as with commoners. There were no trumpets, only the steady beat of horse bells. Negotiations often ended not with pleasurable banquets, but with profound discomfort. Some ambassadors felt insulted that no luxury acknowledged their rank. Others left in awe, believing they had spoken to a living mystic disguised as ruler. Reports to their home courts grew contradictory. He was a visionary reformer, a cunning ascetic, a dangerous fanatic, or perhaps all at once. In distant capitals, artists painted him surrounded by clouds, while pamphleteers warned that behind his humility hid ambition so vast it laughed at crowns. Within the empire, his example began to blur the distinction between faith and governance. The 10th throne became the literal center of a creed without scripture, anointed by repetition. In villages, small tents were raised beside wells where people gathered at dusk to pray for simplicity. Every family kept a modest bowl of ashes near their doorway, symbol of restraint against greed. He hadn't ordered this movement. It grew of itself. At first, he welcomed it as a sign that spirit had taken root. But as thousands of followers started calling themselves children of the tent, rejecting worldly authority altogether, he realized that devotion had become contagion. Some refused to pay even the modest taxes he had established, claiming that the wind commanded otherwise. The man who had freed them from excess now faced rebellion born from imitation. He summoned the leaders of this new sect and received them with kindness. They expected reward. Instead, he gave admonition cloaked in parable. "When the tree's shadow forgets the tree, it thinks itself forest," he said. "Remember where your shade comes from." Most bowed, chastened, but fanaticism dies slower than hunger. The moment illustrated his greatest paradox, that ideals powerful enough to build a nation are also powerful enough to unmake it. Meanwhile, pragmatic generals interpreted unrest as proof that tolerance had stretched too far. They urged a return to solid rule, to show strength in visible form. "A palace would calm the doubtful," argued Tolgan, the old strategist who had once advised humility. Age had replaced idealism with caution. Stone reminds men that ideas can endure. The conqueror considered this, walking outside into the vast moonlight. Before him the tent city slept, its lamps flickering like scattered stars. For a fleeting second he did imagine a palace, its roofs looming, its corridors echoing with command, and felt something close to temptation. But then a gust flattened the grass, and he saw again the horizon, seamless as ever. "Endurance," he murmured, "belongs to the wind." The next morning he ordered that the tent remain, but he agreed to build public storehouses of stone for grain and tools. It was fragile compromise between vision and necessity. Years passed under that arrangement. The empire continued to thrive in modest rhythms, fair harvests, minimal crime, borders secure. To many it seemed a civilization finally at peace with itself. Yet within the Conquerors' circle, dissatisfaction festered like smoke in a sealed room. Younger officers, ambitious and educated by administrators from foreign lands, saw potential for expansion through trade. They proposed minting a new currency, marked not with rulers' faces but with symbols of labor, an attempt to merge morality and commerce. He hesitated. Currency, he believed, was gateway to greed, but he also feared stagnation more than defeat. After long deliberation by the fire, he approved limited coinage of iron discs, nearly worthless to touch but heavy enough to remind owners that wealth carried burden. The experiment pleased no one completely, but proved workable. Markets revived cautiously, and his epithet as the conqueror who banned gold gained new nuance. He had not banned exchange, only worship. That nuance was lost on rivals. Neighboring monarchs, interpreting the shift as weakness, reopened hostilities. Raiding parties tested borders. And for the first time in years, his calm dominion faced real war again. As armies gathered, his generals begged him to move command to fortified quarters. He refused, insisting that the tent remain at the front lines as before. When battle began, flaming arrows fell some piercing fabric. Still he stayed inside, issuing orders unshaken. Afterwards, soldiers recalled his silhouette lit by fire through the wounded cloth, a living icon of defiance. Victory came, though barely, and the image of the burning tent that did not fall became new legend. But it also deepened divisions. To the idealists, proof of faith supremacy. To the pragmatists, reckless symbolism that risked everything. When peace returned, cracks widened beneath the surface calm. Wealth from victories filled storerooms, tempting administrators who whispered that if gold were cursed, perhaps silver was innocent. Corruption crept again as quietly as a serpent in grass. The conqueror sensed it, the old sickness stirring in human hearts, but his strength was fading. Years of campaign and abstinence had carved him lean as bone. He could no longer ride for days or fight storms unaided. Nights found him seated before the eternal fire, eyes distant, perhaps seeing ghosts of choices. He often repeated a phrase he'd once told his followers: "Power and penance share the same tent." Those near enough to hear never forgot it. During his final council of that year, he gathered every general and advisor around the fire. The wind howled outside, threatening to rip through the seams. "This tent," he said, "has outlived its first purpose. It taught us humility, but humility now must learn courage. When I am gone, do not build palaces in my name. Build fairness instead." The words settled heavy as stone. Some wept, others already measured what might follow. He dismissed them before dawn, walking alone into the pre-morning chill. The canvas flapped behind him like wings ready to fold. That night a storm crossed the plains, and legend says the emperor stood atop a rise, watching lightning ignite the world like shattered mirrors. A servant found him hours later still standing, drenched, eyes closed, whispering thanks to the wind that had been both teacher and witness. Perhaps he sensed the arc of his journey nearing completion, that every empire, no matter how righteous, must sooner or later return to dust. Yet until that moment he remained what he had always been, a man choosing cloth over stone, motion over monument, faith over possession. The tent still stood behind him, unburned, its fire glowing faintly like the heartbeat of a giant creature asleep. As history measured his reign, chroniclers would struggle to categorize it. Some called him saint, others hypocrite wrapped in humility. But none denied that under his rule, an empire learned to bow not to wealth but to conscience. When later generations erected temples in his honor, They shaped their domes like shallow tents, an echo of the man who proved that authority held in open hands lasts longer than that locked in golden walls. And on clear nights when wind crossed the plains, people swore they could still hear the rustle of canvas somewhere beyond the horizon, where a patient fire waited, reminding the living that every throne begins as a tent and every palace ends as one. The decree came not with fanfare but silence. One morning, as the dew still clung to the fields, couriers rode from the capital carrying sealed scrolls stamped with the dark mark of the horizon, a line dividing earth and sky. Inside each scroll was a single proclamation, destined to disturb the world more violently than any battle he had ever fought. The document declared that from that day onward, gold was outlawed, no longer currency, no longer emblem, forbidden as measure of worth, forbidden as adornment. It was to be surrendered, melted, and rendered neutral. The words fell like thunder in halls of merchants and palaces of nobles, and carried like music through the huts of peasants. The conqueror had spoken. The metal that men worshipped was to be unmade. The edict's simplicity masked its audacity. Entire economies rested on the gleam of that metal. Kingdoms had risen and crumbled by its promise. A single ingot could buy loyalty, privilege, or murder. Yet this ruler, whose empire stretched farther than any before him, decided that the sickness of the world could be cured only by erasing its most sacred symbol. To him, the logic was unassailable. If greed was the root of corruption, then purge the soil where greed grows. He had seen how gold distorted human virtue, the way it could make the generous insecure, the brave cruel, the wise foolish. It had turned priests into merchants and monarchs into hoarders. He believed that by stripping it of meaning, he could free humanity from the invisible yoke they'd learned to love. Historians later argued over the true spark for this radical act. Some said it was outrage after discovering corruption spreading anew behind his back, tax officials gilding their ledgers, generals hiding wealth inside hollow scrolls, a return of the disease he fought so long to cure. Others claimed a deeper cause, a theological revelation born from his solitude beneath the endless sky. Witnesses recalled that shortly before the edict, he spent 3 nights without sleep, meditating beside the sacred fire. At dawn, pale and calm, he emerged and whispered to an aide, "The sun is reminder enough of gold. Men need no imitation." Whatever the origin, conviction replaced doubt as completely as flame replaces darkness. When the decree reached cities, reaction split the empire along every class and creed. Merchants reliant upon metal exchange tore at their hair. Goldsmiths wept. Bankers fainted, fearing livelihoods undone overnight. Entire markets froze. Trade caravans stalled mid-journey. In temples where statues shone with gilded faces, priests ordered attendants to cover them in cloth, unsure whether to obey or resist. But among the common people, the mood was different. Peasants who'd never touched a coin beyond tax collection sang in streets calling the act divine justice. In dusty courtyards, mothers lifted children and murmured, "You will not grow up slaves to glitter." The same decree that shattered the wealthy's world stitched hope into the poor's. Inside the tent throne, debate raged. Advisors begged him to reconsider. Without gold, they warned, trade would collapse. Diplomacy would suffer. Neighboring powers would see weakness and attack. His answer was calm, almost amused. He spread 2 handfuls of grain on the floor and said, "This feeds armies, not metal." Then he swept aside the grains and drew a circle in the dust. "If the world is circle," he said, "why must one point of it shine brighter? Balance cannot exist where gold rules value." Some saw wisdom. Others saw doom cloaked in metaphysics. Yet his conviction was so absolute that opposition evaporated in its heat. The enforcement began with unsettling precision. Inspectors visited treasuries, workshops, homes. Those who surrendered gold voluntarily were praised. Those who hid it faced confiscation and exile. The collected metal was melted in vast furnaces until molten rivers ran through the capital like veins of fire. The sight terrified and mesmerized onlookers. At night, the horizon glowed crimson from smelting, a false sunset born of human greed burning away. He ordered that the purified bullion be cast into plain blocks and buried deep under mountains, guarded not by soldiers but by silence, no records of location, no maps, only rumor that the wealth of ages slept unseen. For him it was burial of an idol. The psychological effect was unprecedented. Even those who celebrated the decree felt an unease they couldn't explain, a sense of emptiness, as if part of the world's color had been drained. Shops looked duller, jewelry vanished from necks, coins replaced by tokens wrought of iron or leather. The emperor's face appeared nowhere. His humility demanded anonymity, yet his presence filled absence like breath fills lung. In art, painters replaced gold leaf with ochre, discovering new shades of beauty untainted by brilliance. Poets wrote verses praising the simplicity of dull metal, finding holiness in reflection rather than shine. For nobles, the shock was existential. Without gold, their distinction dissolved. Robes trimmed with thread of bright metal now looked like common cloth. Carried in plain carriages, forbidden adornment, they stared at their own hands as if seeing them for the first time. Some renounced titles and joined monastic service. Others plotted rebellion in shadows. A consortium of merchant princes in the southern provinces conspired to restore the old economy, secretly minting coins in defiance of law. Their plots were discovered within a month. The conspirators were not executed, but sentenced to labor-building irrigation channels, a punishment that humiliated more deeply than death. The gesture proved his decree wasn't vengeance, but surgical correction. For ordinary people, the moral vision was hypnotic. Markets adopted barter economies. Craftsmen traded skill for meals. Many reported newfound contentment, unburdened by the chase for accumulation. But not everyone could adapt. In towns once rich with foreign trade, hunger soon crept. The collapse of exchange left shelves empty. Economists centuries later would liken it to a heart rebuilt without arteries. The paradox sharpened. A society pure but fragile, righteous but starving. The conqueror faced consequences of idealism turned practical. He responded by creating a system called the measure of effort. Instead of gold, value was assessed by time and labor. Hours worked, hardships endured. It was revolutionary, but near impossible to regulate over distances. Yet his magistrates tried, documenting toil instead of coin, weighing worth in sweat and skill. Some communities flourished under it. Others stagnated. He accepted the turmoil as necessary penance. A storm cleans faster than drizzle, he said, echoing his justification for earlier wars. Beyond the borders, rival empires watched with awe and terror. The idea threatened their foundations more than his armies ever had. What happens to kings whose crowns lose meaning? Priests feared decline of tithes. Merchants foresaw trade collapse. Some launched propaganda calling him enemy of civilization, spread rumors that his fields decayed. His people starved, but spies sent to verify returned uncertain. Yes, markets were disrupted, but there was order among chaos, a humility not born of conquest but of conscience. He has broken the metal law of mankind and still breathes, one spy reported, which makes him dangerous beyond measure. Within his court, strain grew sharper. Pragmatic generals argued that enemies would soon unite against them. Replacing gold meant replacing alliances maintained by bribes and tribute. They urged partial repeal. The emperor listened, eyes reflecting the fire's glow that had melted wealth. If faith bends for fear, it will break under ease, he said. His tone suggested exhaustion, but not surrender. And so the decree remained intact, burning brighter even as its creator began to dim. That year, chroniclers noted a shift in his demeanor. His speeches grew shorter, gaze distant. He often walked alone through markets to watch people barter, fishermen swapping nets for grain, women trading woven cloth for salt. Sometimes he smiled with melancholy satisfaction. Other times he seemed haunted, as if witnessing an experiment whose outcome defied even him. They trade as if they have known this all along, he said once to Tolgan, yet their eyes still search for the gleam. Tolgan nodded but said nothing. He understood that what his ruler saw in those eyes was humanity's oldest reflection, the lure that built and destroyed civilizations again and again. Even as the emperor outlawed gold, desire for it pulsed quietly beneath the skin of existence, waiting for light strong enough to reveal its color again. The conqueror knew it too. That knowledge became the ache behind his calm. At night he would sit before the eternal fire that now burned inside an iron basin, run the ashes through his fingers and mutter, "Men have buried gold, but not their hunger." Servants heard these words like prayer or warning, unsure which, despite unrest, life continued. The empire adjusted in strange rhythms. Without coin, ceremonies lost glitter but gained sincerity. Gifts came to mean effort rather than expense. Weddings were marked by exchange of handmade tools, symbols of partnership rather than prestige. Temples repainted ceilings with pigments from soil and bark. Slowly, the empire's identity shifted from spectacle to substance. Foreign traders, at first reluctant, began to accept barter for goods. The value of honesty became itself a commodity. Ironically, trade revived not through greed but through necessity. The conqueror's impossible vision was, against every prediction, limping into function. Yet the wound within the hierarchy deepened. Elites who had obeyed outwardly began nurturing resentment. Without gold, their distinction from commoners had vanished. They whispered that faith had gone too far, that the emperor, once luminary of justice, had become zealot against the very instincts that made humans thrive. Letters of dissent appeared, unsigned, scattered across markets, comparing his edict to eclipsing the sun to cure heat. Spies traced the authors to a coalition of nobles and merchants, uniting under a banner they called the Gilded Dawn, devoted to restoring the natural order of wealth. When the plot reached the emperor's ears, he neither raged nor punished immediately. He invited their envoys into the tent. The meeting became legend. There sat men draped in stolen gleam, hidden bracelets, gilded hilts, proof that rebellion glinted even in darkness. They presented arguments with measured politeness, that the ban humiliated culture, destroyed arts, frightened allies. When they finished, the emperor rose silently and took a small mirror from beside the fire. It was made of polished bronze, dull compared to gold, yet clear enough to catch reflection. He held it out to them and said, "You fear the world will lose beauty if gold disappears, yet you cannot name one thing gold has made beautiful except itself." Then he pointed the mirror toward the flames. "Look, the fire shines without metal. So will we, if we remember the source of light. No orders, no threats, just a metaphor that drained the blood from their faces. Within days, the conspiracy dissolved. Its members shamed more than conquered. Still, history is not converted so easily. Across the empire, smuggling rings emerged, melting captured gold into tools, ornaments, hidden trinkets. The banned metal became contraband of faith, a temptation in physical form. He responded not with further crackdowns, but with sermons disguised as decrees. The law, he wrote, may bind hands, but only wisdom binds hearts. Increasingly, his governance resembled priesthood. The 10th throne became sanctum of introspection more than politics. Observers described him as both luminous and withdrawn, as though he conversed more with his conscience than with men. Some whispered that he'd grown weary of mortals, that he meant to transcend the world entirely. Theologically, scholars of later centuries dissected his reasoning like surgeons. They said his ban on gold represented a cosmic inversion, turning human progress outward to inward. Economists compared it to striking the heartbeat from a body to teach it silence. Philosophers called it necessary madness, proof that ethics demand extremity to reveal truth. Psychologists, centuries later, would trace mankind's obsession with the metal to evolution itself. Shimmering surfaces, promising fruit or water to early eyes. Gold had hacked perception. To see it was to feel reward. The conqueror, knowingly or not, fought biology with philosophy. Few battles in history were braver or more doomed. Inside him, fatigue grew. The emperor's health declined under strain of endless vigilance. Even minor fevers became trials. He refused physicians, relying on meditation and exposure to wind. Tolgan once begged him to rest, to ease the laws slightly, to restore currency in limited form. He only smiled. "If I die keeping faith," he whispered, "it will live longer than I." The statement chilled the strategist, for he began to suspect his ruler considered death itself another decree waiting to be sealed. In the 5th year after the edict, drought struck. Crops failed. Trade slowed. Critics claimed divine retribution for defying gold's sanctity. Crowds gathered at temples arguing theology. Some priests broke under pressure, reopening shrines with gilded altars. The emperor rode personally to confront them, skeletal from fasting. Standing before a mob ready to riot, he raised a lump of unrefined iron and shouted, "This feeds your plough. That," pointing to shining altar, "feeds only your pride." The crowd fell silent, shamed by the raw logic of survival. Yet even as obedience returned, so did pity. They saw not infallible leader but solitary man, fighting an element larger than empire, the element inside every human soul. Gradually, the decree's heat softened into permanence. Children born after its issue grew up unaware that gold had ever been sacred. For them, its absence felt natural. They played with iron coins, knowing only the weight, not the brilliance. In schools, teachers recited parables of the old world's downfall by greed. In songs, heroes triumphed through humility rather than wealth. The empire had been ideologically rewired in one generation, a feat no conqueror before or since achieved. Yet the man who achieved it lived like ghost of his own myth, retreating more often into solitude. Witnesses described him watching the buried bullion fires on distant hills, where gold's last embers glowed underground, as if listening for sighs of a sleeping dragon. The night before the 6th anniversary of the edict, he gathered his council for one final reflection. The air was heavy with rain. "We have buried a god," he said to them, "but gods tend to resurrect when memory forgets why they died. Guard remembrance." He then ordered new chronicles to be written not of battles but of motives, the reasoning behind laws, so that future rulers would understand intention, not merely imitate action. That was his last major decision. Soon after, he fell ill, his body at last surrendering to years of austerity. Lying in his tent, he asked for no gold, no relics, only the small bone bowl once given by the wandering monk of his youth. He held it close and murmured, "This was enough." When dawn arrived, he looked toward the horizon line on the banner above his bed and smiled faintly, as if seeing sunlight for the first time free of any gleam. The empire mourned. Couriers relayed his death with reverence equal to revelation. Around the world, reactions differed. Nobles exhaled relief, commoners wept, philosophers took up pens. Gold, that old mirror of humanity, waited quietly in the ground, patient as sin. Within a decade, his successors would wrestle between ideology and need, debating whether to unseal the buried treasure. Some would hold, others would fail. But regardless of outcome, one truth endured. A man once dared to tell civilization that its brightest metal was merely polished fear, and for a while, millions believed him. Centuries later, when archaeologists rediscovered traces of those hidden furnaces, they found nothing but ashes fused into stone, the color neither gold nor gray but something in between, a testimony to paradox. Scholars held fragments up to light and marveled at how dull they were and how beautiful. The conqueror had been right in one regard. The sun still shone, humanity still bartered, and even without gold, life glittered in its own way. His edict remained both wound and wonder. The day power tried to cure desire by burning its reflection. And though time would reawaken the metal, the echo of his defiance lingered like faint firelight under the world's surface, whispering to every age that dares call itself enlightened, "Beware the things that shine too well." Victory was changing shape. In the early years, conquest had felt clean, a righteous wind sweeping through decadence, a new order carved from decay. But as the empire unfolded across continents, the air around it thickened with smoke that smelled of both triumph and remorse. Cities no longer merely surrendered. They were judged. Each campaign carried not only weapons but sermons. Soldiers rode under banners proclaiming purity. And with every fortress taken, morality itself was enforced as fiercely as law. To outsiders, his empire looked less like a nation expanding than a crusade consuming the world. The first of those crusades struck the city of Harlem. a coastal jewel famed for its markets lined with gold-tiled roofs. From distance, the city shimmered like molten sunrise. It was wealth incarnate, an affront to the edict that had become the spine of his reign. When his scouts described its splendor, the conqueror looked toward the sea as if hearing a challenge whispered by the horizon. "Gold still breathes," he said quietly. Then he gave command to march. The army moved in silence, thousands of hoofbeats muffled by sandstorms. When they arrived, Haarlem's walls reflected light so fierce it burned the eyes. The king of Haarlem, arrogant in prosperity, sent emissaries carrying tokens of submission wrought in gold filigree. The messengers laid them at the emperor's feet. He stared at the offerings with pity, not anger. "You do not yet understand," he murmured, returning the gifts to their bearers. "I will accept surrender of hearts, not metal." They left bewildered, and within days his army encircled the city. The siege was swift and surgical. His forces cut supply routes, avoiding bloodshed where surrender might suffice. Yet the city resisted, trusting wealth to buy delay. When gates finally broke, his soldiers entered not as looters but as executioners of doctrine. They carried torches dipped in oil, heading straight for the mint, the vaults, the merchant guild halls. Witnesses later said the burning of Haarlem glowed brighter than the dawn. Flames devoured gilded rooftops, melting centuries of opulence into rivers of fire that ran toward the sea. The air trembled with the roar of collapsing treasuries. Amid chaos, one temple escaped the blaze. He ordered it preserved because its altar, though grand, bore no gold, only carvings of grain. "Leave what honors life," he said. "Destroy what worships itself." After darkness fell, he walked alone through the ruins, face illuminated by embers. That night he wept, though no one saw. Perhaps he cried for the people, or perhaps for the purity forced to pass through violence to prove itself. Word of Haarlem's fall spread as parable. The city of golden roofs turned to cinder because it refused to abandon vanity. Devotees called it purification. Skeptics whispered it was obsession. Within the army, unease grew. Soldiers who once fought for justice now felt hunted by their own virtue. In taverns and tents they spoke quietly, wondering if the line between cleansing and cruelty had vanished beneath ash. Yet the conqueror pressed on, sweeping south where decadence persisted like disease. Lines of captives filled the roads, merchants, lords, priests, and before each trial he repeated the same decree: lenience for repentance, fire for arrogance. For many cities it was enough. Gates opened peacefully. Gold surrendered willingly. But not all were wise. The gilded capital of Basra Mir was worst. Built upon terraces and mirrored lakes, its palaces shone even at night, reflecting moonlight with surgical precision. Its ruler, a queen famed for beauty and cunning, refused to dismantle her throne. When envoys delivered his message, she laughed, a sound carried halfway to the camp by cold wind. The conqueror heard it and said, "Then the wind will answer her." His generals readied engines of siege, but he ordered delay, waiting until festival day when the city would gather around its royal lagoon. At dusk his riders circled unseen, and when the first fireworks erupted above Basra Mir, his catapults answered with fire. The spectacle of pride became conflagration. From distant hills his army watched towers crumble, water turning amber under flame. He forbade slaughter. Civilians were guided out, treasures left to burn. When the queen was captured, she asked why he spared her people. "Because sin belongs to the powerful," he said. Then he turned away, leaving the once gilded capital in silence. Basra Mir's destruction completed his legend as both redeemer and ruin. But even legends rot at their edges. Within the inner circle, friction sparked. Tolgan, aging strategist caught between loyalty and fatigue, began to question privately whether principle had devoured mercy. "Fire purifies," the emperor repeated when challenged. "So does understanding," Tolgan answered, weary. Their friendship thinned but didn't break. Both knew the empire's stability depended on it. Yet among younger generals, men untempered by hardship, murmurs of ambition grew louder. Some saw these burnings not as moral acts, but as convenient justifications for imperial possession. "Why destroy?" one whispered. "What could enrich our cause?" Greed, dormant for years, stirred again in human hearts like smoldering coal revived by oxygen. Reports reached the emperor of officers hoarding relics from conquered cities, rings, goblets, coins, once hidden from the flames. Fury overtook him not because of theft, but because of betrayal of faith. He summoned the offenders, stripped them of rank, and exiled them into deserts without escort. Their disappearance became legend, a parable on loyalty. The desert keeps no secrets for the faithless. Yet beneath admiration, many soldiers trembled, asking themselves whether such punishment was justice or severity edging into tyranny. The empire, meanwhile, grew enormous. Mountains and oceans seemed to bow before this idea clothed in flesh, a man whose authority flowed from poverty. Cities of the east fell as willingly as those of the west, but the further the boundaries stretched, the thinner the spirit inside. Local governors governed by fear of inspection, not love of virtue. Laws multiplied to maintain the illusion of moral order. People began quoting his edicts not as guidance but as threat. The conqueror had forged morality into weapon. Now, like every weapon, it cut indiscriminately. One night, riding back from campaign, he stopped in a razed village once praised for artisanship. Fires still smoked among half-ruined workshops. He dismounted, walked through blackened beams, and found a small metal figure, half melted, of a child holding a flower. He turned it over in his hands, seeing gold glint faintly inside the slag, a stubborn glimmer that refused extinction. Something in that shimmer pierced him. Even fire cannot teach every lesson, he whispered. The soldiers watched as he knelt, buried the figure carefully in the ash, and ordered no further burnings without personal command. It was the closest thing to repentance the army would ever witness. Nonetheless, order had to be maintained. Rebellion erupted briefly in the west, led by displaced merchants claiming to fight for freedom to trade. His generals wanted to crush them quickly. He agreed but demanded restraint. During the battle that followed, an entire town was accidentally set ablaze. Thousands died. When news reached him, his calm fractured for first time in years. Witnesses said he rode through the smoke-filled ruins without a word, face streaked in soot and grief. That night he convened his officers around cold ashes instead of a fire. "I wanted a world cleansed of greed," he told them, "and instead I have taught men how to burn better." None dared reply. The silence that followed marked beginning of decline more than any defeat could. In the weeks that followed, the emperor drifted between silence and command. He moved his court to a plain far from conquest, as if distance could dilute guilt. The tent that had once symbolized purity now felt heavy with ghosts. He ordered no new campaigns until the land could breathe again. Yet an empire built on motion cannot sit still. Armies idled, soldiers restless, administrators anxious. The wheels of conquest groaned like beasts denied their prey. Rumors began to swirl that their leader had lost his conviction, that the very fire which had burned away decadence was finally turning inward to consume him. Tolgan found him one morning standing alone on a ridge above scorched fields. "So you taught me that power must rest," the old strategist said, trying to console. The conqueror answered merely, "Rest or rot, sometimes both." His eyes seemed fixed on something far beyond the horizon, perhaps the memory of what the world had once looked like, before his shadow stretched across it. The wind lifted dust into small spirals around his feet, tiny whirlwinds carrying ash and soil together, the remains of what was once pride and harvest alike. Reports kept arriving from distant provinces. In one territory, a zealot governor burned down his own city's temple for containing gilded mosaics. In another, soldiers sold relics they were supposed to destroy. Faith had fragmented, reflecting the contradictions of its creator. Some enforced his decrees with fanaticism. Others corrupted them for profit, most simply obeyed from habit. The emperor realized his words had become law long after their meaning had thinned. When he spoke now, courtiers nodded before hearing. His authority, once born of respect, had matured into fear. He decided to travel again, disguising himself among commoners. Accompanied by a handful of guards, he passed through towns where people still sang his songs, but with new tones, more nervous tribute than sincere belief. In one marketplace he saw a boy selling trinkets carved from clay, painted dull yellow. "Gold that isn't gold," the boy joked. The emperor asked, "Why paint them at all?" The child shrugged. "People like shine even when it lies." That single sentence cut through years of doctrine more cleanly than any rebellion. He bought the toy quietly and kept it. Later he would place it beside his pillow, as reminder that truth cannot erase longing, only live beside it. As months turned, dissension hardened into crisis. 3 prominent generals, men shaped by his victories, began plotting to revive trade and reopen treasuries under their own authority. They believed the empire could not endure under perpetual scarcity. When the emperor learned of it, pain, not rage, filled him. In council he faced them calmly. "You wish to rule by gold again," he said. "Then you will rule nothing." He stripped them of command but spared their lives, sending them to govern remote provinces where temptation might cool. It was mercy, but also recognition that coercion alone now sustained his reign. After the purge, he gathered remaining commanders and addressed them around the familiar circle of fire. His voice carried neither fury nor triumph, only fatigue carved into wisdom. "We have conquered too much," he told them. Conquest was once medicine. Now it is appetite. Many lowered their eyes, ashamed. "The world we set out to purify is vast," he continued, "but the dust on our hands clings just the same." He ended the meeting without farewell, leaving them facing the slowly dying flames. Outside, snow began to fall, a quiet, indifferent judgment from the heavens. Despite exhaustion, threats at the borders renewed. Neighboring empires long cowed sensed hesitation and struck. Towns along the frontier fell under siege. The emperor rallied what remained of faith, directing defenses personally. Again he moved his tent to the edge of danger, sleeping with soldiers, drinking from shared bowls. His presence steadied them. They fought with desperation, not for spoils, but for survival of an idea. Against all odds they triumphed, but the cost was immeasurable. Entire regiments perished, and the land on both sides of the border became wasteland, a belt of lifeless plains later known as the Grey Corridor. Victory had rarely looked so much like defeat. Back in the capital, celebrations rang hollow. People lined streets bearing burned banners, not sure whether to mourn or cheer. The conqueror passed through them like spectre, expression unreadable. He returned to his tent, collapsed near the sacred fire, and stayed there for 3 days, saying nothing. When he emerged, the lines on his face seemed to have deepened by 10 years. He announced that the empire would cease expansion indefinitely. "Let our wounds become teachers," he declared. "Faith without patience is flame without lamp." From then on his campaigns ended, but unrest within did not. Time shifted its rhythm. Seasons blurred, life resumed around ashes. Farmers began replanting raised valleys. Artisans rebuilt homes. Yet shadows of the burned cities haunted every wall. Storytellers recited epics of the Great Cleansing, but their voices carried uneasy admiration, half praise, half lament. It was said that in some towns, children played among blackened stones pretending to conquer and burn in imitation of their hero, not yet old enough to understand tragedy from triumph. The conqueror once overheard such play and turned away quickly, as if struck. He sought solace again in silence, withdrawing to pilgrimage across his own realm. On one journey he revisited Harlem, the first city he had burned. Time had softened the scars, grass-covered ruins, and new dwellers lived simple lives where gold once ruled. They greeted him kindly, unaware at first who he was. Only when elders recognized him did they bow trembling. But he lifted them gently, saying, "Rise. I came to learn if fire can create gardens." They told him the soil, rich with ash, now yielded better harvest than neighboring lands. He smiled faintly, murmuring, "Even guilt feeds growth." Yet tranquility couldn't undo weariness. In his entourage, rumors spread that his temperament darkened at dusk. Some nights he laughed with humility. Others he stared into empty air as though listening for the voices of flames, long extinguished. "I purified the world," he would whisper, "but who will purify me?" Tolgan, always near despite age, once answered softly, "Perhaps the wind again." They smiled sadly, both knowing what that meant. Then came the final fracture, the revolt of the western marshes. It began as protest against famine, but grew into rebellion fed by exiled nobles and ambitious officers. They claimed to fight in name of freedom, but their banners shimmered with stitched gold thread. This rebellion wounded him deeper than any external war. It was greed reborn, wearing colors of liberty. His advisors insisted on total annihilation of rebels, but he hesitated. Every burnt city echoed in his mind. Deliberation delayed response until rebellion spread too wide. Finally, necessity overrode guilt. He led his army himself one last time. The march was brutal. Rain turned roads to mud, supplies dwindled. For days battles raged across swamps lit by lightning. At length the rebels were surrounded. When captured leaders were brought before him, he offered them the same choice he once gave kings: renounce gold and live in labor, or cling to it and burn. Though exhausted, they laughed in his face, saying, "You cannot erase desire." He regarded them sadly. "No," he answered, "but I can deny it a throne." Moments later, fire consumed their camp and the rebellion ended. When the smoke cleared, the emperor remained seated in mud, staring into the dying blaze. His soldiers expected proclamation of victory, but none came. Instead, a single sentence fell from his lips, soft as wind over ashes. "We are all merchants of something." Those nearby realized he no longer spoke as ruler, but as penitent. He returned to the capital with diminished escort. People cheered instinctively, but enthusiasm met silence. He regarded the crowd not with pride, but with distant tenderness, as though looking upon children who would one day outgrow his creed. That night, standing outside his tent, he looked toward the horizon where the ruined cities lay unseen but remembered. Flames had given way to stars, each one a silent ember of the past. "Perhaps this was always your design," he said to the sky, addressing God, fate, or the conscience of mankind. "That every effort to cleanse the world leaves soot enough to remind us we are still human." He turned, entered his tent and closed the flap. From far away, travelers said they still saw faint glow above his camp. Neither fire nor lantern, perhaps imagination, a small reminder that the age of ash and faith had not truly ended. For though the wars had ceased, the battle between virtue and desire continued within everyone who had followed him. His empire stood vast, scarred and uncertain, like a prayer half remembered but too powerful to forget. The Conqueror, once hunter of gold and enemy of greed, had become something larger and lonelier, a man trapped between holiness and human hunger, ruler of an empire built on conscience and flame. The years after conquest were quiet only on the surface. Beneath that stillness, the Conqueror was changing, moving away from the language of command into the cadence of contemplation. The sword had grown heavy, its very weight a question. Every morning he rose before dawn and walked outside his tent to greet the wind. Those who watched said it seemed less ritual than conversation, the sky the listener, the steppe his cathedral. His generals now called him not emperor but seeker. The title fit. The man who once guided armies now sought to guide meaning itself. His empire stretched wider than any map could hold, but his attention turned inward, toward invisible frontiers, between faith and doubt, virtue and fatigue. Messages arrived from frontier governors begging orders to build monuments, codify trade, or punish corruption. Yet days passed with no response. Instead, he spoke to ascetics, monks, poets, shepherds, even prisoners, asking them what truth looked like when stripped of fear. His attendants complained he wasted time on philosophy while bureaucracy frayed. But he could not ignore the pull of introspection. "I have built walls against greed," he told them, "but not yet a door for mercy." Word spread that he was writing a book, though none ever saw it. What little emerged were the fragments of his talks, aphorisms murmured to gatherings at dusk, where soldiers sat beside peasants around large fires. He spoke without notes, and his voice, once ferocious, now carried calm resonance, each phrase measured like breath. "All things belong to motion," he said. "Stone is a trap the earth sets for light." Another evening he told them, "Equality is not when men share wealth, but when they share limits." These statements puzzled many, inspired some, frightened others. The soldiers used to simple commandments now wrestled with parables that offered no clear answers. For them, certainty had always been armor. Now their leader handed them mirrors instead. To the faithful, His words sounded like scripture being born. To skeptics, like exhaustion sanctified. Throughout the empire, people began to gather his quotations onto hide and cloth. Monks calligraphed them into scrolls collectively known as the Wind Sutras, though the Conqueror never endorsed the collection. He hated canonization. The moment words stop moving, he reminded them, they become idols. Yet his criticism only deepened reverence. It was as if the world decided, with or without him, that he was prophet disguised as man, teacher disguised as ruler. Religion, which he once treated as ally or danger, depending on circumstance, now seemed to him a liquid concept, flowing between cultures, changing forms, but pointing always to one horizon. Old priests came to test him. Philosophers came to debate. He welcomed them all, letting discussions stretch through nights of firelight and fatigue. If there is a God, he said once, it must be patient enough to wait until we stop arguing about him. Reports described moments when even the skeptics bowed, moved by his gentleness rather than doctrine. Over time, his empire developed what modern historians call moral syncretism. Temples rebuilt without images, festivals celebrating humility instead of harvest. Worship became more about silence than songs. Yet the deeper his teachings spread, the lonelier he grew. His disciples adored him. His soldiers obeyed him. But few understood him anymore. Loneliness had always shadowed conquest, but this was different. It came from altitude, not distance. The higher moral ground he occupied, the fewer could breathe alongside him. He began spending nights outside the camp, staring at stars until dawn stiffened his joints. It was there he conceived his cosmology. The universe, he told his chronicler, is a circle of two breaths, giving and taking. When men exhale greed, the world inhales ruin. When they inhale humility, the world breathes easier. The chronicler wrote it down hesitantly, unsure whether it was philosophy or prophecy. Gradually, his image surpassed his presence. Spontaneous pilgrimages began toward any place associated with his footsteps. People sought relics, stones from his camp, ashes from his fires, water he had touched. He discouraged it with increasing desperation. Do not worship the shadow of virtue, he warned. Follow its movement. But devotion, once released, obeys no master. Traders started selling imitation relics, and black markets of holiness sprang where gold once ruled. The paradox made him nearly laugh. It seemed faith too could be bought, just with different coin. Within his councils, power shifted toward thinkers rather than warriors. The new ministers were scholars who translated his speeches into policy, sometimes clumsily, often inaccurately. They formed schools teaching his ethics as structured philosophy, naming it the path of balance. He tolerated them even as he winced at their zeal. Balance, they said, is mankind's final conquest. But he knew balance was never final. It shivers ceaselessly like flame. Watching them draw diagrams of morality, he remarked to Tolgan, "They will turn the wind into a wall before they are done." Tolgan, aged beyond recognition, smiled faintly. "You taught them too well." The emotional cost grew immense. As veneration hardened around him, simple conversation vanished. Every word he spoke was dissected, quoted, engraved. Servants carried scrolls to copy even his casual remarks. When he tried to speak as a man, people heard prophecy. When he stayed silent, they heard revelation. He confessed once to a hermit friend from early days, "My echo is louder than my voice." The hermit replied, "Then speak softly until the echo learns to listen." He took the advice to heart, reducing public appearances, letting his generals govern in his name while he wandered through plains revisiting the sites of earlier battles, now reclaimed by grass. Nature's patience humbled him more than victory ever had. During one such journey, he stopped at the river where his mother had once prayed over his birthplace. The water, though shallower, still reflected the same sky. Kneeling there, he murmured that the steppe had always been his true teacher. "Its silence taught me scale," he said to the chronicler who followed at distance. "It reminds me that our grandest ideas vanish like hoofprints by dawn." Over months, these confessions collected into a philosophy of impermanence. He declared, Public festivals where people built elaborate sculptures of clay only to dissolve them at dusk. This, he told them, is worship, the joy of building without the fear of loss. It became a spectacle of beauty and melancholy witnessed by thousands, though few grasped its intent. They wanted eternity. He offered ephemerality. Such ideas drew skepticism from pragmatists across the empire. Governors complained that these principles gave citizens restless hearts, unwilling to commit to projects requiring permanence. "You unmake ambition," one said bitterly. The emperor answered, "I release it from anxiety." His retort did little to calm administrators struggling to keep their provinces functional. For them, philosophy did not fill granaries. Dissonance between moral vision and human need widened each season. Yet even detractors felt awe, while other rulers fought for immortality through monuments. This one seemed devoted to erasing himself. By the end of that decade, he appeared transformed enough that chroniclers described him as translucent, personality worn thin by contemplation. The conqueror had vanished. In his place stood the prophet of the steppe, voice resembling the landscape, itself vast, disciplined, merciful, and uncapturable. But however luminous prophecy looked from distance, within it burned immense solitude. Loneliness carried its own revelation. He began to see isolation not as punishment, but as lens, a way to observe the empire as one might watch clouds from above, shifting, shapes of ambition, powered by the same wind that sustained his tent. Each region practiced his teachings differently. In one province, compassion meant communal living. In another, it hardened into fanatic austerity. Some chanted verses promising equality, others twisted them into justification for control. From his vantage, he saw what he had both created and unleashed, a doctrine resilient enough to inspire, elastic enough to be distorted. "The steppe," he whispered one dawn, "teaches freedom because it cannot be fenced, but men always bring posts." He assembled his council once more, this time composed less of commanders than of philosophers and travelers, voices less interested in empire than experience. They met under the open sky. The tent walls rolled up so horizon encircled them fully. The emperor did not sit higher than anyone. He lay back on a plain rug, eyes on stars beginning to appear. "Tell me," he said, "what is the meaning of victory now?" A poet answered. "Perhaps to end the need for victory," another added, "to forgive what you cannot fix." He listened, nodding slowly, the ghost of a smile cutting through fatigue. "Then maybe," he said at last, "the first war we fought was workshop for this conversation." He paused, then murmured almost to himself, "And the truest enemies were never the kings, but the ideas inside us that preferred gilding to clarity." These sessions transformed into something resembling symposium more than council. From them arose a philosophical lineage, later scholars called the doctrine of the horizon, a meditation on balance between material and divine, motion and rest. Its symbols were drawn from the simple geometry of the land, the circle of sun, the vertical of man, the horizontal line of banner that had always marked his army. Between ground and sky, he told them, there is line of humility. We walk it or we fall. The phrase became mantra repeated across centuries until its simplicity rivaled scripture. Yet for all his insight, questions still tormented him. As success rippled through generations, hierarchy inevitably returned. Even among monks who preached equality, someone had to keep order. Someone had to lead the chant, decide the rhythm, extinguish the fire. The empire had not abolished hierarchy. It had merely changed its ornament from gold to virtue. Maybe heaven too has generals, he mused, half bitter. Perhaps perfection only exists in silence, because silence has no form to betray it. These reflections filled the notebooks he now kept instead of commands, a mosaic of doubts more honest than any edict. Later, historians would call them the ash journals, written ink made of charcoal dust, words that wavered between sermon and confession. His health waned again. Fasting and reflection left him frail, walking with a staff carved from steppe cedar. Still, people flocked to hear him speak. They gathered at twilight where grass met horizon, and he would address them without script, the sun bleeding behind him until he looked half ghost, half flame. Equality, he declared, is not destination but daily labor. Every sunrise we begin it anew. Silence followed before one listener asked, "And when the sun sets?" He replied, "Then we forgive ourselves for failing and promise again tomorrow." Those who heard carried the moment in their bones, certain they had witnessed a man conversing with eternity. But within his nights a private storm built. He dreamed often of cities burning, their ash rising only to turn into stars, looping endlessly above. Sometimes he woke grasping his chest, not from pain but from recognition. Faith and destruction, creation and loss were different words for the same breath. "Maybe the universe forgives itself through us," he wrote one sleepless dawn, "for making beauty temporary." The chronicler, watching him finish the sentence, said the emperor's expression mixed sorrow with relief, as if articulating the mystery finally eased it. When spring returned, he decided on one final pilgrimage to the farthest edge of his empire, where the sky curved nearest to earth. The journey took weeks. Villages along the route poured from huts for glimpse or blessing. He smiled, but distance in his eyes warned them not to follow. He seemed lighter than before, speaking little, surviving on milk and flatbread. One evening his horse stumbled, throwing him to ground. He laughed softly and said, "Even the earth wants me closer." The remark became legend, the prophet joking with destiny. At the journey's end, he reached a vast dune plain bordered by mountain ridges. There he built no altar, only pitched his old weather-stained tent one last time. The accompanying chronicler described the moment, how he entered the tent at dusk, carrying neither book nor weapon, only the bone bowl and a small lump of clay. All night the wind howled, shaking the fabric but never tearing it. At dawn he emerged, eyes clear, features serene. "The world," he said to the chronicler, "is round so that truth can chase itself without ever catching up." Then he raised the clay toward rising sun and crushed it in his fist, letting dust scatter, a final symbol of impermanence. He remained there for days, gathering disciples who arrived despite his requests for solitude. They built small encampment around him, calling it the Circle of Breath. Each evening he spoke, each morning he sat in silence. The teachings from those days became the foundation of a softer faith that survived his empire's eventual decline, a creed focusing on transience, compassion, and restraint. However, even amid reverence, divisions sprouted. Some disciples wanted doctrine codified, others insisted on endless interpretation. He smiled, watching them argue, whispering to Tolgan, who had followed despite frailty, "See, friend, even peace demands opponents." Tolgan chuckled until cough overtook him, and both men laughed through it, knowing laughter was final rebellion against rigidity. As summer edged toward autumn, he sensed approach of ending. His voice weakened but retained warmth. In his last, address to gathered followers, he said, "Remember, we are the steppes' children. The horizon is our teacher. When you doubt, walk east until you meet dawn. When you grow proud, walk west until dusk humbles you. Between those two lights lies all religion you will need." People wept openly. Some tried to touch his robes, others fell to knees. He blessed them with weary hand. "Go," he urged, "and let even my words decay. Truth rots slower than lies, but it must rot too, otherwise it becomes idle." That night, sitting before a small fire on the plain, he told Tolgan he had made peace with both conquest and consequence. "The world is addicted to shape," he said. "It fears what cannot be measured. Yet the wind still carries us." Tolgan, nearly blind, replied, "And who carries the wind?" The emperor smiled, staring upward. "Perhaps nothing, and that is freedom." Those were among his final recorded words. Soon after, disease struck the camp, perhaps fever, perhaps exhaustion. When attendants checked on him one morning, they found him motionless, facing sunrise. His expression showed neither struggle nor serenity, only stillness that seemed continuation of breath rather than its end. The tent flapped gently, echoing through silence. He was gone. News traveled slowly but changed everything it touched. Across provinces, priests laid down symbols. Soldiers disarmed. Peasants built fires facing east to honor the man who turned empire into meditation. Over time, myth replaced memory. Some claimed he vanished into horizon itself, that wind absorbed him as thanks for devotion. But long after stories blurred, one lesson endured: the possibility of ruling without possession, of believing without certainty, of conquering without killing. In every generation, when greed begins to gleam again, someone whispers his name into the dust as reminder that a man once tried to live as both ruler and pilgrim, and almost succeeded. Long before his death, the seeds of betrayal had already germinated, quiet, stubborn, inevitable as weeds between stones. Peace had dulled the swords of his generals, but had not dulled their appetites. The empire that he had insisted must breathe like the steppe now felt to them, like a prison woven of ideals. Without the old wars to fight or treasures to seize, ambition turned inward, feeding on itself. Discipline eroded into restlessness, restlessness into resentment. Outwardly all was calm. His decrees still echoed through the provinces, his name invoked with reverence. But beneath that reverence something coiled and waited. Greed denied becomes its own religion, patient and vengeful. It began with whispers in the frontier camps. Supplies grew scarce, the soldiers unpaid under the new barter economy. Officers argued that virtue didn't fill bellies. The emperor wants saints, they muttered, but marches us like beggars. These grumblings reached the capital where nobles, stripped long ago of status and ornament, listened with sympathetic ears. They missed their silks, their jewels, their arrogance. Many of them had survived the Edict of Gold, outwardly submissive, but inwardly fuming, biding their time until faith weakened enough for retribution. To such people, the old General Corsan became a lodestar of resistance. Corsan had once been trusted above all others, brilliant tactician, mentor to younger officers, the kind of soldier who could read wind and terrain as though conversing with the earth. The emperor called him my iron brother, and often said their friendship was forged not of affection, but shared endurance. Yet over years, reality gnawed at iron. Corsan saw provinces fraying under moral austerity, trade thinning, foreign envoys mocking their simplicity. He watched his men starve by degrees while the emperor preached patience. "We have defeated greed," the ruler told him once. Corsan bowed, but his reply carried warning. Majesty, even hunger can become a greed when left too long. The emperor smiled wearily. Then we must learn to hunger well. It was perhaps the first time his wisdom felt like cruelty to loyal ears. Months later, a dispute erupted near the northern mines. Though gold extraction had ceased, iron and salt were still drawn from earth, fueling barter economy. Workers rebelled against harsh quotas imposed by local governors who blamed isolation for shortages. Corsan was sent to calm them, but instead of punishment he promised reinstatement of limited coinage, his attempt at pragmatic mercy. When word of this reached the capital, the emperor summoned him. The meeting took place inside the familiar tent. Fire flickered between them like judgment. "You gave them metal back," the emperor said. "Only a token exchange," Corsan replied. "Men cannot live on wind." Silence followed, heavy as armor. Finally the emperor said, quietly but fatally, "Then perhaps you no longer remember how to breathe it." The dismissal was swift, courteous, final. Corsan left the camp stripped of command, his loyalty replaced by something colder. Men he had trained still revered him, and where admiration lingers, rebellion waits. Within months, underground councils began assembling in desert towns, uniting dissatisfied nobles and soldiers under vague slogans of renewal. Restore prosperity, restore dignity. In their secret rhetoric, dignity meant luxury, prosperity meant gold. A counterfaith was forming, not worship of greed outright, but faith in compromise masquerading as reason. They swore theirs was not rebellion but correction. The emperor sensed it long before facts emerged. Sharp as ever, he recognized the smell of revolt in the air. The subtle change in how messengers spoke his name, the late arrivals to council, the sudden politeness hiding impatience. but he refused to tighten control, believing that trust must survive even suspicion. "If I rule by fear," he told Tolgan, "I betray everything we built." The old strategist, frail yet lucid, warned otherwise. "Mercy among wolves is invitation," he said. "Close the gates before the storm pretends to be breeze." The emperor shook his head. "Better to be undone by faith than preserved by doubt." That sentence would one day serve as his epitaph. Soon assassinations began, small at first, barely noticed. A judge found poisoned, a courier missing on the road, a storehouse set alight. Each event could be accident, yet together they formed shadow of intent. Investigation revealed nothing. Witnesses vanished. The emperor refused to retaliate without proof. He insisted justice must remain precise, even when precision costs blood. His restraint emboldened conspirators. Letters intercepted from the frontier bore Corsan's seal, cloaked in coded phrases. "Restore balance, rekindle flame." His followers took these as call to arms. Garrisons mutinied quietly, declaring allegiance not against the emperor, but for practical virtue. They promised no bloodshed, only reform. But reform painted with sword's edge is always revolution. When the first banners of revolt appeared on northern horizon, marked with twin lines, their interpretation of horizon's symbol turned upside down, the emperor felt the chill of prophecy fulfilled. "They have inverted belief itself," he told his council, as if to prove that gravity pulls morality down like stones. His advisors begged to raise full army, crush rebellion before it spread. He hesitated, haunted by memory of burnt cities, wishing to spare his own land from fire. Too long he had ruled by example rather than terror. Now he wondered if terror was fluent language of politics all along. The two armies met on plains under bruised sky. Yet battle never began. Secret messengers had already eroded the imperial ranks. Whole battalions defected, swearing they fought for same ideals he taught. Soldiers shouted through dust, "We follow your truth better than you." Confusion froze the loyalists. The emperor watched from a hillside, face unreadable, realizing he was witnessing perfection of irony. An insurrection born straight from the seed of his teaching. The vision had devoured its creator. That night campfires burned both sides of the valley, twin constellations mirroring each other. Somewhere out there Corsan waited, friend turned phantom. The emperor sent no spies, only walked alone beyond his guards until he reached ridge between armies. In darkness he saw another silhouette approaching, tall, limping slightly, sword in hand but lowered. They stopped a few paces apart, silence stretching like unlit horizon between them. "You taught me the wind can carry words farther than steel," Corsan said softly. "So listen to it now. The people are starving not for gold but for balance." "You gave them emptiness and called it freedom?" the emperor replied, his voice almost tender. "I gave them a world where no man owns another. They long for cages because walls keep out fear." Corsan smiled sadly. "Perhaps. But a bird without nest still dies in rain." No one witnessed what happened next, only that both men turned away alive. At dawn, Corsan's banners advanced and civil war began. The empire cleaved by philosophy sharpened to blade. For weeks, dust eclipsed the horizon. The plains that had once carried songs of unity now echoed only hooves and mourning. The civil war unfolded like mirror-breaking in slow motion, each shard of the empire reflecting a different version of the same faith. Cities that had burned in the name of purity now burned again in the name of freedom. Temples stripped of gold became fortresses of rebellion. Farmers hid behind ruins, unsure which side now represented virtue. The emperor watched reports pile before him, victories that felt like losses, losses that almost felt like relief. He no longer recognized the nation he had created. Even compassion had split in two, half serving him in loyalty, half serving his detractors under another word for righteousness. He faced every decision as if balancing on air. To fight too fiercely would confirm their accusation of tyranny. To hesitate would surrender principle to chaos. Each choice endangered what remained of meaning. At council, he listened to frantic plans, generals urging total annihilation, priests begging diplomacy. Tolgan, aged to frailty, whispered from his palate, "You once taught that gold enslaves men. But it was never metal, it was the need to win. The Emperor nodded, understanding the sentence too late. He looked around at faces lit by uncertain firelight, realizing that faith was devouring language. No sentence could lead a man free once belief had chosen its prey. Corsan advanced steadily toward the capital, not in rage but grim duty. His proclamations were careful. He fought, he said, to restore balance, not crown. But every principle once armed becomes ambition. His followers plundered in the name of redemption. The Emperor ordered restraint. He wanted no martyrdom, no pyres. This is no holy war, he insisted. It is grief arguing with itself. Yet grief cares little for reason. The first great battle between former friends erupted near the dry riverbed of Ithera. Thunderless, windless night. The clash began with confusion and ended with irony. At dawn, both sides lowered weapons out of exhaustion. Thousands lay still, dust covering them indistinguishably, rebels and loyalists now identical statues of clay. The Emperor walked through the field afterward, touching faces gone nameless. "This," he said softly, "is gold returning in another form." His spirit fractured. No poem, prayer or law could clean the madness. He returned to the capital where unrest crept closer daily. The city's alleys, once lined with debate and song, filled with silence. Advisors tried to rally his authority, but he saw futility. "My crown is smoke," he told them. "How can I rule what will not breathe?" Tolgan, near death, begged him to flee while loyalty remained. But the Emperor refused. "If I ever run from my own truth, it ceases to be true." When Tolgan finally died, the last thread to his human past snapped. He buried his friend beneath the steppes' soil with his own hands, whispering, "You were my proof that faith could still laugh." That night, he sat alone beside the grave, listening to winds carry fragments of distant fighting, wondering whether nations and gods were perhaps only synonyms for the same loneliness. Inside the capital, betrayal completed its circle. Ministers secretly opened gates, promising safe conduct to Corsan's advancing forces. They reasoned it was mercy, to end war quickly, but mercy born of fear still smells like fear. As dawn broke, rebels entered almost unopposed, banners grey with dust, faces drawn from long marches. Corsan led them through streets thick with anticipation. Civilians peered from windows, not cheering, not mourning, only watching history trade names. In the palace district they found, instead of resistance, the Emperor seated before the familiar tent, pitched in middle of marble square. The sight unsettled even the triumphant. Surrounded by his last few guards, he appeared calm, almost curious. "You arrive as I expected," he greeted Corsan. "The wind told me last night." Corsan dismounted slowly. "I mean to end this with dignity," he said, "not vengeance. And yet both smell the same when the earth drinks," replied the Emperor. "Tell me, brother, what will you build now that destruction is yours?" Corsan's jaw tightened. "A gentler order, one that feeds the living before sermonizing the dead." The Emperor gestured toward the city behind them. "Feed them well, then. But remember, gold returns faster than truth. Witnesses would argue forever about what happened next. Some said the Emperor reached for a weapon, others that Corsan mistook gesture for threat. The clash was brief, a shout, a blade's flash, a slow exhale. When dust cleared, the Emperor knelt bleeding, eyes open but unaccusing. He whispered something none heard clearly, perhaps only wind moving through a body that had outlived itself. Corsan caught him before he fell, murmuring, "Forgive me." "I already did," breathed the ruler, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "Long ago, when we both still believed we were right." And with that, the breath left him, carried into wind that had followed from his first campfires. The soldiers stood silent. The capital, unsure which emotion to choose, held its voice. There was no shout of triumph, no fire of vengeance. The tent flapped softly beside its fallen inhabitant, cloth brushing helm of the man who had become both conqueror and conscience. Corsan ordered him buried without splendor, on the same hill where the Empire had first sworn its oath. No gold, no monument, only a mound of steppe grass to catch horizon's light. When they lifted the body, a small clay token fell from his hand, a child's toy painted dull yellow. Corson stared at it as though staring into endless mirror of remorse. Weeks later, the new rulers restored coinage, raised banners gilt with metal threads, and reopened trade. Prosperity returned, yet restlessness lingered. Markets bustled, but laughter felt brittle, as if echoing around absence too vast to fill. Poets wrote of their dead prophet, sometimes worshipping him, sometimes blaming him for years of scarcity. The empire gradually forgot his language, but not its ache. Every law thereafter carried faint residue of his ambition, to live without chains, yet leave none unbroken. Corsan ruled for a few seasons before yielding to illness or guilt. It was impossible to tell which claimed him first. On his deathbed he ordered all gold objects in his chamber removed. "It burns the eyes," he said. His final words repeated, those of his fallen friend. Better to be undone by faith than preserved by doubt. In that echo their destinies fused again, two ends of one conviction torn apart by fear of compromise. Centuries later, travelers crossing the same plains would find a small heap of stones marking the grave of a nameless king. Locals called the site the place where wind pauses. They said that on still days, dust there doesn't drift. It hovers as though deciding which story to believe. Scholars debate whether that calm is miracle or trick of air, but storytellers know truth is rarely so tidy. The empire survived under other names, its wealth reborn, its conscience reburying itself with each new generation. Yet sometimes during twilight, when markets close and coins clink softly in pouches, merchants claim they feel faint unease, a breath of wind across their ears, whispering not words but question. Did purity save him or slay him? There is never answer, only the hush that follows, a silence shaped exactly like regret. The years after betrayal were a twilight that seemed to stretch forever. The empire, though alive, moved as if haunted by its own shadow. Markets boomed again, and gold gleamed once more in the hands of men. But joy returned without innocence. The whisper of his name followed every coin, quieter than superstition but louder than faith. People spoke of him in past tense, even as monuments elsewhere tried to pretend he had never existed. Yet somewhere along the edges of maps, stories, emerged that the Conqueror still lived, alone, stripped of rule, walking across the plains like ghost in flesh. Whether rumor or wish, it spread until no one knew where memory ended and hope began. In truth, he had left before dawn the day after the revolt ended, heading east where horizon devoured color. Exile was self-chosen. Redemption, perhaps imagined. Those who glimpsed him from caravans described a solitary rider, wrapped in weather-worn cloak, leading no army, carrying no banner, his tent folded behind saddle. Villagers offered shelter. He declined, preferring corners of open earth where the breath of the world had not yet learned hierarchy. "I rode once to conquer," he told a shepherd who recognized him only by tone. "Now I ride to apologize." The man later swore that instead of gold coins, the emperor pressed into his hand a smooth stone, saying, "Worth does not need shimmer to remind itself of weight." Months turned into years, marked only by wind and dust. He drifted from steppe to mountain, following rivers like veins toward heart of creation he could neither name nor claim. In small hamlets, he repaired tools, taught children to read, helped dig wells. When people realized who he was, he disappeared again, leaving behind only short prayers carved into wooden spoons or scratched on stone walls. All things borrowed must be returned, even power. Pilgrims soon hunted these inscriptions like relics, though he had meant them as counsel, not scripture. His legend began to outpace his breath. The final journey came when his health failed at last, his body exhausted by austerity and age. Fever haunted him at night. In dreams he heard rustling gold beneath earth, calling softly, like water beneath ice. Sometimes he answered in whispers, half question, half confession. Are you still root of everything or just mirror of my sin? He took this as omen to return once more to the place where everything had begun, the vast plain where his first tent had been pitched. There, he believed, silence waited like an old friend keeping fire alive beneath ashes. The path was cruel. His handful of attendants begged him to turn back. He smiled gently, repeating, "Every road leads home when you stop measuring distance." They reached the plain at dusk on a windless evening. The horizon burned faint red, and the land smelled of impending frost. There he ordered the tent raised one last time, identical in shape to all that had sheltered him before, worn fabric patched and welted from decades of storms. He insisted no one light torches. "The sky will be bright enough," he said. And indeed stars arrived quickly, patient witnesses gathering for final testament. Inside, his possessions fit into single bundle. The monk's bone bowl, a leather journal of aphorisms, a piece of dull iron that once had been coin, and the small yellow clay trinket of a child's making. He laid them before the fire as if to counsel them, murmuring that each represented a lifetime. To his attendants he spoke softly. "When men kill for gold, they murder their reflection. When they worship it, they bury their worth. Promise me, you will let the world forget where this fire burns." They promised, though tears blurred their words. As fever worsened, he drifted in and out of clarity. They say he kept murmuring about dust, that everything sacred must learn to become dust again. At moments he spoke to unseen companions, perhaps to Tolgan, perhaps to his younger self. "We were blind and pure," he said once, "and blindness may be the only purity possible." Near midnight he grew lucid. He asked that the tent flaps be opened so he could see the sky. The attendants obeyed, and cold air slipped inside carrying smell of earth after long drought. He raised his hand weakly, palm catching faint starlight. "I questioned gold," he whispered, "but not the sun. It still forgives us both." Somewhere outside the wind stirred, thinning the fire to amber glow. His hand lowered, then stilled. They found him the next morning seated upright, face peaceful, eyes open toward dawn. No treasure surrounded him, no crown, not even his name inscribed anywhere. The tent fabric moved gently across his shoulder, like caress of invisible friend. After brief silence, the attendants buried the body quickly, following his wish. He had ordered no tomb, no sign. "Return me to the steppe," he had said. "Let grass learn my story." They obeyed, choosing a hollow of ground where wind never lingers long. When they left, only the fire's black circle remained, one more piece of night swallowed by earth. When his attendants tried to find the grave days later, the landscape had already erased it. Wind had folded every track, and the slight mound had flattened into the eternal curve of the plain. They searched for hours but could not locate the spot. One swore he had marked it with a stone, yet every stone looked the same. Others claimed the earth itself had accepted the emperor, drawing his body down until it was indistinguishable from soil he had loved so fiercely. In frustration, they built a cairn on the nearest ridge and prayed simply, "May he travel where weight ends." Then they scattered, vanishing into the weather like seeds. What happened afterward belongs to history's tremor rather than its records. Rumor spread through the empire that he had risen again, not in flesh but dissolved into the elements. Some said when storms crossed the steppe, they could see a figure forming in the dust before melting back into rain. Farmers claimed their fields grew greener where the wind touched. Wanderers told of a low voice warning them to tread mercifully. For the faithful, his disappearance was confirmation of sanctity. He merged with what he worshipped, they said. Earth has her prophet again. For the doubters, the mystery became inconvenience. A missing grave invites imagination. Imagination invites defiance. New rulers demanded his location be found, fearing a legend that refused containment. Expeditions scoured plains for months, digging, prodding, unearthing nothing except whispers and wind. Still the tales multiplied. One legend insisted that beneath the steppe lay a hidden chamber, where the emperor himself had buried a hoard of gold long before the edict, a deliberate paradox, testing if mankind could resist temptation once the gleam returned. Travelers swore they had seen flickers of light under certain moons, as if fire smoldered underground. Entire villages vowed never to dig deep, for fear of releasing the curse of brightness. Merchants on caravan routes began dropping offerings of iron at roadside altars, murmuring, "Sleep, O restless metal, can't till man learns modesty." Scholars debated whether the story symbolized repentance or warning. Miners called it nuisance, scaring workers from the veins of profit. In time, the empire fractured beyond repair. Successor kings reinstated wealth, temples, hierarchy, each claiming to restore balance he had broken. Yet even as gold once again ruled currency and crowns, his ghost lingered, whisper of other possibilities. Statues of him appeared in distant provinces, never of stone or metal, only of clay easily ruined by rain, as artists mimicked the lesson of impermanence. Pilgrims traveled empty-handed to the steppes seeking enlightenment, returning describing a stillness so vast it erased the self. Priests argued over doctrine he had never written. Philosophers quoted his aphorisms against tyranny of wealth. Centuries reshaped him from ruler into myth and from myth into warning. In every generation his name returned when greed reached new heights, as if conscience had found a voice but could speak only through ghosts. Some chroniclers doubted he had ever existed at all. They reasoned that no single man could have altered history so completely without monuments to prove it. Yet fragments persisted, a bone bowl preserved in a monastery cupboard, an iron coin etched crudely with line dividing top from bottom, a child's toy of faded yellow clay found buried near vanished campsite. To believers, these remnants were enough, a trinity of humility, labor, and innocence. To skeptics, they were coincidences shaped by storytelling. But whether truth or invention, his absence achieved what presence never could. Unending conversation about what civilization owes its conscience. Years later, a poet wandered those same plains with parchment and ink, made of soot. He wished to write the final chronicle of the man without a grave. In a dried river basin, he set his tent where the horizon curved just so, and there he felt a wind unlike any before, steady, circling, intimate. It pressed through fabric like breath. The poet wrote, "He melted back into what he had refused to conquer. The sky keeps him as echo, the earth as rumor, the wind as will." The poem spread far beyond its modest intention, becoming mantra across centuries. From then on, travelers greeting the steppes' dawn would whisper that same line, half prayer, half acknowledgement that humanity still measures itself by what it fails to own. The myth finally left the realm of religion and entered philosophy. Universities recited his life as paradox, a man who sought equality through control, peace through purging, simplicity through empire. Ideologues dissected him as case study in moral extremes. Saints revered him as martyr of conscience. Economists quietly pitied his astronomy of ethics that ignored hunger's gravity. Yet none denied the fascination of his ending. To rule the world and choose to vanish without trace, some called it cowardice, others genius, most simply mystery. And mysteries, if told often enough, become truths of their own. Today, when dust rises along those ancient routes, children still chase it, laughing that they glimpse the emperor of the wind. Elders smile but silence them quickly, remembering how stories invite spirits to listen. And somewhere between myth and meteorology, between shimmer of metal and humble dirt, his legacy continues, less monument than movement, perpetual question rather than answer. For even now, every empire that lifts itself too high confronts his echo in its marrow, the reminder that power, once stripped of humility, turns to ash faster than gold can melt, that the most enduring tomb may be the one the earth refuses to keep. Centuries passed, and the empire of the horizon faded from maps, but never from imagination. What began as one man's revolt against greed turned, over time, into a mirror held before every generation that followed. Chroniclers disagreed on boundaries, dates, even his name. But they agreed on one certainty. The world never forgot the conqueror who rejected gold. His story became less biography and more reflection, a moral compass that kept turning toward questions humanity still could not answer. Every civilization that rose afterward inherited both his legacy and his dilemma. Kings who built palaces of marble cited him as caution. Monks wandering barefoot across deserts whispered his sentences as scripture. When republics replaced empires, reformers read translations of his decrees, seeing early blueprint for equality. Idealists named him philosopher before his time. Cynics dismissed him as dreamer doomed by purity. Yet even dismissal required respect, because he had drawn an impossible line between desire and duty, and dared to stand upon it. In the East, poets reshaped his sayings into cosmic parables. One volume, called The Breath of Dust, described him as wind made human, moving across eras to remind rulers that humility is the oldest law. In the West, artists painted him gazing over empty landscapes, his tent glowing faintly like a conscience at the edge of empire. Later, social visionaries quoted him unknowingly when preaching restraint, self-rule, or stewardship of the earth. His doctrine crossed languages, because every society contained its own version of worship. Money, image, control, and therefore its own need for his ghost. Modern historians analyze him less as saint, more as symptom. They write that his obsession proved how power naturally swings between greed and guilt, empire and asceticism, each extreme producing the other. Economists discuss his ban on gold as failed experiment, but brilliant metaphor, the attempt to cancel a symbol by will alone. Psychologists call it structural rebellion, the human urge to purify excess by inventing new excesses of purity. Each discipline finds itself implicated. None can fully dismiss the allure of what he tried to do. Across ages, rulers who briefly renounced luxury, all the emperors who washed feet of servants, the kings who walked barefoot one day a year. The presidents photographed among the poor traced their gestures, knowingly or not, to him. And whenever they failed to sustain humility, scholars compared them to the same inevitable parable, that virtue, once institutionalized, curdles into pride. His story carried warning sharper than sermon. Even rejection of wealth can become a crown, yet no lesson remains static. By the 20th century, an age of industry, invention, and unrelenting appetite, his legacy shifted tone. Futurists quoted him as precursor to minimalism, the idea that simplicity was luxury's final evolution. Philosophers of ecology heralded him as prophet of balance with nature, reminding the world that dominion ends where the horizon begins. Sociologists studying consumer culture found in his edict premonition against worshipping objects. In textbooks he became archetype, in art counterpoint. The tent replaced the palace's quiet rebellion against noise of progress, and still, the conflict he embodied survived unchanged. Wealth versus virtue, the riddle stubborn as breath. The forms of gold merely changed faces. Coins became credit. Idols became devices. But the glimmer remained. Every age invented its own justification for greed dressed as grace. Yet somehow, amidst glittering speed and steel, whispers of his defiance resurfaced. Monks practicing detachment, communities rejecting consumption, artists stripping aesthetics to elemental beauty. Each act echoed him. The steppe wind entering skyscrapers through cracks of conscience. Some historians argue his influence exists mostly in myth, but myths often outlive policy because they answer deeper hungers. His tent became language of resistance. Movements for simplicity, spiritual or political, borrowed its image. Nomads of liberation, protest camps built to challenge inequality, shelters of fabric erected against walls of marble. An entire lineage of thinkers would picture justice not as palace, but as canvas, flexible, breathable, transient, human. In that imagery, the conqueror lived again, not as ruler but as metaphor reminding civilization that permanence belongs only to sky. For believers, his story is faith in centuries repeating hope. For pragmatists, it is cautionary tale of utopia suffocating under virtue. Both readings are necessary as shadow defines shape. Perhaps his true teaching lay not in any law but in his failure. That moral perfection, when forced onto flawed world, burns what it meant to save. Centuries proved this contradiction eternal, and in accepting it, later generations discovered maturity, to seek goodness without demanding purity, to value moderation over miracle. Still, the symbol endures. In museums around the world, Small displays preserve what may or may not be fragments from his reign. A rusted bowl, a cracked coin, a strip of canvas found in ruined monastery. Visitors stand before them transfixed, not by authenticity, but by what each artifact implies. That once there lived a man powerful enough to own everything, and humble enough to sleep beneath something that could blow away overnight. The instinct to kneel before such paradox remains modern humanity's quiet superstition. Empires collapsed, nations changed, ideologies rose and fell. None erased his imprint entirely. He lingers wherever conscience meets power, in speeches that promise equality, in pledges to serve instead of rule, in architects designing sustainability rather than splendor, even in moments when leaders pretend at humility for the camera. His tent flaps invisibly behind every podium, reminding all that authority is borrowed air. Each century reads him differently. Where early scholars saw saint, later ones saw strategist. Yet behind every interpretation lies the same unease, the recognition that abundance and virtue rarely dwell in the same house for long. Even our most rational societies shade their monuments with that memory. Cities he never walked still, bear statues of nameless horsemen facing into morning light, as if each generation quietly recreates him in bronze to argue again with its own reflection. The argument never ends. We build, we gild, we destroy, then rebuild, chasing perfection and fleeing guilt in one gesture. In that rhythm, the Conqueror still rides. Modern philosophers treat his experiment as mirror to their own anxieties. They speak of sustainability, emotional economy, the mental weight of ownership. His edict against gold becomes allegory for our struggle with excess of data, possessions, self-importance. To live lightly upon the earth, they say, is the ultimate courtesy. But courtesy seldom survives ambition. And so his shadow moves through airports, boardrooms, digital spaces. A reminder that wealth unexamined consumes both planet and spirit. In quiet corners of universities, students reading his story see environmentalism wrapped in epic, a sermon about gravity disguised as history. In popular imagination, he floats between eras, part monarch, part monk, half cruel, half kind. Novelists dress him in different languages. Filmmakers project his tent against blue screens. Critics debate if he was tyrant or teacher. Each recreation, however inaccurate, renews the old fascination. How could anyone so powerful choose poverty? The question unsettles because it exposes the border we all secretly patrol. How much must we own to be secure? How much can we let go and still remain ourselves? The Conqueror's answer, that security born of ownership is illusion, still drifts through our collective conscience like dust we cannot sweep away. For us, the tent has become symbol of paradox, structure both fragile and enduring. Architects study its design for efficiency. Spiritualists adopt it as metaphor for impermanence. In some modern deserts, humanitarian camps use its form to shelter the displaced, giving the ancient vision literal rebirth. Each flap lifted to air repeats his message unintentionally, that dignity resides not in possessions, but in space one creates to breathe. In that light his empire outlasted time. It moves with the wind, wherever people remember that home is not wall but horizon. And so the legend circles back to us, the inheritors of both his triumphs and failures. We measure progress by wealth, measure virtue by simplicity, and forever oscillate between the two. Perhaps it is the motion itself that defines civilization, the pendulum swing between luxury and restraint, greed and grace. The Conqueror merely pinned the pendulum mid-air for a heartbeat, long enough to reveal its pattern. That heartbeat became myth, and myth became mirror. Whenever we confront our appetites, whether for power, fame, or comfort, it is his reflection that silently asks, "What will it cost you to feel rich?" Historians close their accounts with footnotes about his missing tomb. But poets prefer the other ending, that the world itself became his burial ground. Every grain of sand a memory, every gust of wind a page of unwritten scripture. Inside that poetic exaggeration lies pragmatic truth. A man who ruled continents left less trace than a merchant's coin, yet his silence still instructs louder than empires. The steppe that once carried his armies now hums with grass and insects, indifferent and intact. Nature, patient and amused, has done what even his ideals could not, turn grandeur back into balance. When dusk falls across those plains, the outline of a simple tent sometimes flickers in mirage. There one heartbeat, gone the next. Travelers call it the spirit of the horizon, though scholars dismiss it as trick of heat. But to those who pause and listen, the wind grows articulate, whispering fragments older than any creed. Power is borrowed. Gold is a mirage. The earth remembers humility more kindly than it remembers rule. Then the sound dies, leaving only the rustle of grass, the soft applause of a planet grateful to rest. Perhaps that is the true end undescribed by history. Not victory, not failure, but return. The conqueror who banned gold and lived in a tent did not vanish. He became the question that keeps humanity awake, the question of how to shine without owning the light. And as the story closes, the camera of thought pulls back to sky above steppe, where all banners have dissolved. All crowns turn to dust and only one truth remains, quiet and unmeasured. Maybe the richest man who ever lived was the one who feared gold the most.